Hey there, and welcome back. Whatever this day has asked of you, however long its hours have run, you can let it go now, the whole of it, and let the room soften and dim around you, and let the breath ease and slow in your chest. There is nothing left for you to carry tonight. Let the warmth of the bed gather you in, and come away with me a long way back, more than 600 years, into the life of a woman who was born a princess of one kingdom, became the ruler of a second, and was crowned the queen of a third, and who would end her days famous, of all the strange things in a strange life, for a crime she almost certainly never committed. Tonight we are following the fortunes of a daughter of the high Pyrenean kingdom of Navarre, a child of one of the most feared and treacherous kings of her age, who would grow into one of the most travelled and tried women of the whole medieval world. She would marry a duke who was old enough to be her father, and bury him, and rule his land for his son. She would give up her own children to marry a second time, for love, an exiled English lord, who against every expectation would seize a crown. And at the very last, an old woman and a dowager queen, she would be accused of the darkest crime the age could name, of plotting to murder a king by witchcraft and black sorcery, and would be stripped of everything she owned and shut away in a crumbling castle by the very stepson she had loved and favoured above all others. Her name was Joan of Navarre, and we are bound tonight, far into the small and quiet hours, toward the strangest passage of her story. The day the only Queen of England ever charged with sorcery was carried off to her prison, and the still stranger day, years afterward, when the dying king who had jailed her gave the order, almost with his last breath, to set her free. Why he did it, and what truly lay behind the whole dark business, is one of the deep puzzles of her age. But that is a long way off down the road of this night. There is a whole life to travel first, and we begin where she began, in the mountains. Before we cross over into her century, there is one small thing I would ask of you. It is a quiet comfort to me in the dark, to know a little of who is keeping me company tonight. So if you feel inclined, leave a line or two below to say from which corner of the world you are listening, and how late the hour has grown where you are lying. I look through the notes that come, every one of them, and there is a soft pleasure in imagining all those scattered and shadowed rooms, each of them hushed, each given over for a little while to the same old story as the night comes down. And if these slow journeys into far-off times are something you would like to find your way back to, the simplest way is to subscribe whenever the wish should happen to come to you, offered gently and never pressed. And another of these quiet evenings will make its way to you in time. That is the whole of what I wish to say. From here on, the night belongs to her. Picture this: a walled city of pale stone rising from a green river plain, ringed by peaks that hold the snow late into the spring in the small and ancient realm of Navarre, where the lands of Spain and France press up against each other along the spine of the Pyrenees. This is Pamplona, the chief city of that mountain realm, and within its walls, in the years around 1370, a daughter is born into the royal house of Navarre, and they give her the name Jeanne, which the English tongue would one day soften into Joan. Her father is the monarch of this small, fierce country, a man of restless cunning and few scruples, and her mother is a princess of the blood royal of France, a granddaughter of a king of that great kingdom to the north. So the child comes into the world doubly royal, with the blood of two crowns in her veins, born into a high place in a hard age. She is on this day a small person of great consequence, a princess of that upland country, a piece already, though she does not know it, upon the wide chessboard of European royalty, to be moved in time wherever her father's advantage might require. Neither she nor anyone bending over her cradle could have guessed the road that lay before her, the courts and the crowns and the prison cell that waited down the years, the three countries that would each in turn call her their own. For now, there is only a royal infant in a walled city, the daughter of a dangerous king, and the long and winding journey of her life not yet begun. The kingdom into which Joan was born was a small one, but it was old and proud, a realm that had kept its independence for centuries wedged between far mightier neighbours, clinging to its place among the passes, while the great powers of Spain and France loomed on either side. Navarre was a land of steep valleys and walled towns, of shepherds and vineyards and hard stone passes, a kingdom that lived by its wits and its fortresses, because it could never hope to live by its strength alone. To rule such a place was to walk forever on a knife's edge, balancing between the giants, selling one's friendship now to this side and now to that, surviving by cunning what could never be survived by force. It was a school of hard statecraft, this little upland kingdom, and the house that ruled it had learned every lesson that school could teach. The arts of the double game, the broken promise, the alliance made to be betrayed. Into that house and that hard inheritance, Joan was born, and though she would leave Navarre while she was still young and never, so far as we know, return to it, something of its lessons went with her. The deep patience and the survivor's weariness of a people, bred to endure between the millstones of the great. Her people were a mingled folk, the Basques of the Western Highlands, with their ancient tongue older than any other in the land, and the Spanish and French speakers of the towns and the river country, all of them bound together under the old crown of Navarre. The court of that crown looked as much to France as to Spain, for the rulers of Navarre in those years were themselves of French blood, a branch of the great French nobility who had come to the little kingdom by marriage and ruled it with their gaze turned always toward the richer and more glittering world beyond the mountains. Joan's own father held lands and claims in France as well as his mountain crown, and spent much of his restless life entangled in the affairs of the French, scheming and shifting his allegiance in the long agony of the wars that were tearing France apart in those years. So the Navarre of Joan's childhood was not a place apart, shut away among its peaks, but a small player drawn into the largest quarrels of the age, and the royal children were raised with their eyes upon a wider world, knowing themselves to be counters in games that stretched far beyond their own borders. It was a time, too, of deep and constant danger, for the later 14th century, into which Joan was born, was one of the cruelest passages in the history of Europe, an age of plague and war and the breakdown of the old certainties. The terrible pestilence that men would later call the Black Death had swept through the continent within living memory, carrying off a great part of its people and leaving a shaken and a haunted continent behind. The long war between England and France ground on year after year, spilling its violence across the French countryside, dragging in every neighbouring power, Navarre among them. It was an age that had learned to expect catastrophe, that lived close to death and treachery and sudden reversal, and the children of its ruling houses were schooled early in its harsh realities. Joan grew up knowing that fortune was a wheel that turned without mercy, that the high could be cast down overnight and the favoured become the hunted, that no promise was certain and no safety lasting. It was a knowledge that would be tested in her own life again and again, and that she would need, in the end, more than almost any woman of her century. The little realm that gave Joan her name, and her first home deserves a closer look, for it was a curious and a singular place, unlike any other land in Christendom, and something of its character clung to the woman it bred. Navarre lay astride the Western Pyrenees, the great wall of mountains that divides France from Spain, holding a stretch of high country on both sides of that barrier, and the green river valleys that ran down from it. It was small, as kingdoms went, a fraction of the bulk of the giants that pressed upon it. But it was old and it was proud. A country that had worn its own crown for centuries and clung fiercely to the independence that its mountains helped it keep. Its chief city was Pamplona, a walled town of pale stone in a bowl of the hills. An ancient place that had stood since the days of the Romans and had grown up around its great cathedral and its markets and its tangle of narrow streets. A city of pilgrims. For the road to the famous shrine in the far west of Spain passed through it, and the faithful of all Europe came trudging over the passes and down through Navarre on their long way to the tomb of the apostle. The crown of this little realm had passed, 2 generations before Joan's birth, to a French line, a branch of the high nobility of France that had come to Navarre through a marriage and brought with it a French outlook and French ambitions that would shape the kingdom for the rest of its days. These French kings of Navarre held broad estates far to the north, in the heart of France itself, lordships that tied them inextricably into the affairs of the French and gave them a stake in every French quarrel, and they never ceased to look northward, toward the richer and more glittering world beyond the mountains, as much French princes with a Pyrenean crown as Spanish kings with French blood. It was from this restless, ambitious, French-minded line that Joan sprang, and the divided loyalties of her house, half Spanish by their throne and wholly French by their blood and their interests, were her inheritance from the cradle. She would carry that doubleness all her life, a woman of the south raised to look north, at ease on neither side of the mountains that her family's crown bestrode. It was a hard country to rule and a harder one to keep. This small realm wedged among the mighty, and the rulers of Navarre had learned to survive by craft what they could never have held by strength. Hemmed in by the great realms of Castile and Aragon to the south and the towering might of France to the north, Navarre could not stand against any of them in open war. It lived instead by playing one off against another, by shifting alliances and careful marriages, and the endless watchful diplomacy of the weak among the strong. Its kings held lands and claims in France, as well as their mountain crown, and were forever entangled in the quarrels of the French, now siding with one faction and now with another, always seeking in the chaos of the age some advantage for their little realm. It was a school of survival, this kingdom, and the line that ruled it produced, in Joan's father, one of the most accomplished and most unscrupulous practitioners of the survivor's dark arts that the whole age could show. And it produced, in Joan herself, a woman who would need every ounce of that inherited toughness to come through the trials her own strange destiny had in store. The little realm survived in those years, less by the sword than by the wedding ring and the treaty, marrying its daughters into the houses of its neighbours, buying time with fair promises, bending always with the wind that it might not be broken by it. Its people learned to live with uncertainty as a settled condition, to keep one eye always upon the passes and the other upon the shifting bargains of the powerful, never quite secure and never quite despairing, enduring as the peaks themselves endured. It was a hard wisdom, the wisdom of the small and the exposed, and it ran deep in the blood of the line that Joan was born to. And at the centre of her early years, casting his crooked shadow over everything, stood her father, one of the most notorious figures of that whole notorious age. A man whose very nickname has come down through the centuries as a byword for treachery. For Joan was the daughter of Charles II of Navarre, who is remembered by history under the grim title of Charles the Bad, and it is to this dark and fascinating man, and to what it meant to be his child, that we must turn next, before we can understand the woman his daughter became. Charles the Bad was a king who earned his terrible name, and earned it many times over across a whole life of intrigue and double-dealing and bloody-minded ambition. He was a man of real gifts, clever and charming and eloquent, able when he chose to win men to his side and bend events to his purpose. But every gift in him was bent to the service of a boundless and unscrupulous self-interest. And he used his cleverness as another man might use a knife. He had a claim, through his mother, to the throne of France itself, and the entire driving passion of his life was to advance himself amid the chaos of the French wars, to seize what he could in the confusion, to play England against France and faction against faction, always for his own gain, never for any cause but his own. He made alliances and broke them as it suited him, swore oaths and forswore them, plotted murders and rebellions, was imprisoned and escaped and schemed again. A man so slippery and so faithless that no one who dealt with him could ever be sure which way he would turn. The name men gave him, Charles the Bad, was not the judgment of his enemies alone, but the verdict of his whole age upon a record of almost unequalled treachery. To be the child of such a man was a strange and a perilous inheritance. Joan grew up in the household of a father who trusted no one and whom no one could trust. A king forever scheming, forever in danger, forever weaving the plots that would one day recoil upon him. We know little of the particulars of her childhood, for the chroniclers of that age seldom troubled to record the early years of a daughter, even a royal one. We can feel the shape of the world she was raised in. A court of suspicion and shifting loyalties, ruled by a man for whom every person was a piece to be used, and every tie a thing to be broken when it ceased to serve. It cannot have been a tender upbringing in any modern sense, nor a secure one. The children of Charles the Bad were assets to be deployed, betrothed and bargained, and held in pledge as their father's interests required. And Joan would feel the weight of that early, as we shall see. And yet there is something of her father in her too, though turned to far better ends, for she inherited, it seems, his intelligence and his resilience and his gift for survival, the hard-won arts of a house that lived always in danger. The daughter would prove far worthier than the father, but she was his daughter, still schooled in his dangerous court, and she carried out of that schooling a toughness and a wariness that would serve her through all the trials of her long life. There is a darker shadow still that the legend of Charles the Bad would one day cast across his daughter's story, though it belongs to a much later time and to the realm of slander rather than fact. For when Joan, in her old age, came to be accused of witchcraft and dark sorcery, there were those who would whisper that she had learned such arts at her father's knee. That the daughter of so wicked and so uncanny a king must have drunk in something of the black arts in that sinister court of her childhood. It was nonsense, of course, the idle malice that always gathers around a famous name. There is no reason whatever to think that Joan was anything but an ordinary devout woman of her age, and her father, for all his sins, was a schemer and not a sorcerer. But the shadow of his reputation hung over her all the same, the notoriety of the wicked king lending a sinister colour in the eyes of the credulous to the misfortunes of his daughter. We shall come, in time, to that strange accusation and all that lay behind it. For now it is enough to mark that Joan came into the world trailing the long shadow of her father's name, and that the very darkness of his reputation would one day be turned, most unjustly, against her. The career of Charles the Bad, Joan's father, is worth dwelling on a little, for it was one of the most spectacular careers of treachery in a treacherous age, and it shows us the world that shaped his daughter. He had come to the throne of Navarre as a boy, and he carried in his veins a claim, through his mother, to something far larger than his little upland realm. For his mother had been a princess of the royal house of France. And Charles believed himself to have been cheated of a far larger inheritance, perhaps even of the crown of France itself, by the rival branch of the family that had seized it. This grievance, real or imagined, drove him all his life, and he pursued it with a cunning and a ruthlessness that made his name a byword. He plunged into the tangled politics of France in the years of its agony, when the long war with England and the convulsions of plague and rebellion had thrown the kingdom into chaos, and he played every side against every other, making and breaking alliances with a speed that left his contemporaries breathless. He was implicated in dark deeds, in the murder of a high officer of the French crown, in plots and risings and secret dealings with the English enemy. He was imprisoned by the King of France for his betrayals and made a dramatic escape and returned at once to his scheming. He stirred up rebellion, treated with every faction, and seemed to thrive in confusion as other men thrive in peace. There was a real brilliance in him, a quickness of mind, and a gift for intrigue that might, in a better man, have built something lasting. But in Charles it was all bent to the service of a restless and a faithless ambition, and built nothing but a reputation for treachery that has outlasted everything else about him. The name his age fastened upon him, Charles the Bad, was the verdict of men who had watched a lifetime of broken oaths and crooked dealing, and it has clung to him down all the centuries since, so that he is remembered now, if at all, as one of the chief villains of his time. To be reared in the household of such a man was the formation that Joan carried into her own life, and we should not pass over what it must have meant. She grew up watching the master of the double game at his work, absorbing, whether she willed it or not, the lessons of a court where loyalty was a tool and trust a weakness, where each person was a piece to be moved, and every promise a thing to be broken at need. It was a hard and a cynical schooling, and it might have made her hard and cynical too. That it did not, that she grew into a woman of evident warmth and loyalty and steadiness, capable of love and of faithfulness, and of winning the affection of those around her, is a quiet testament to something strong and good in her own nature that her father's dark court could not corrupt. But she carried out of that schooling the one gift it could honestly give, the survivor's hard wisdom, the watchful patience of one bred among dangers, and she would have need of it for her own life. Though she did not deal in her father's treacheries, would be quite as full of peril as his. If her father's name cast a shadow over Joan's life, his schemes cast a more immediate blight upon her childhood, for the daughter of so dangerous a man was bound to be caught up in the consequences of his treachery, and so she was, while she was still very young. Her mother, the French princess, who had brought the blood of the kings of France into the match, died when Joan was no more than a small child of 3 or 4, so that the girl lost early the gentler of her two parents, and was left to grow up in the harsh keeping of her scheming father. And before she was out of childhood, she was made to feel, in her own person, the price that the children of a treacherous king must sometimes pay. For her father's endless plotting against the crown of France at last brought the wrath of the French king down upon him, and as a pledge for the faithless conduct of Charles the Bad, his children were taken and held as hostages at the French court, sureties for a father whose word was worth nothing. Joan, with her brothers, passed a part of her girlhood in this gilded captivity in Paris, a child held to answer for her father's sins, learning early in her own flesh how heavy a thing it was to be the daughter of Charles the Bad. It was a strange and an unsettling apprenticeship for a child, this early lesson in the uses to which a royal daughter might be put. She was a person of value, a princess whose blood and whose hand were assets in the great game, and like all such daughters, she was disposed of and bargained over with no thought for her own wishes. While she was still a girl, her father betrothed her, for reasons of his own advantage, to the heir of the neighbouring kingdom of Castile, a match that would have made her in time a queen of that great Spanish realm. But the betrothal, like so many of her father's arrangements, came to nothing, dissolved when his shifting interests no longer required it, and the child who had been promised a Spanish crown was left to be bargained over afresh. So Joan learned before she was grown the chief truth of her condition, that she belonged not to herself, but to her family's ambitions, to be promised here and withdrawn there as the great game required, a piece to be played, and never a player. It was the common lot of high-born girls in that age, and she bore it as they all bore it. But few can have learned the lesson in a sterner school than the court of Charles the Bad, where nothing was sacred and no tie was safe, and a daughter was simply one more counter in her father's restless hand. The disposing of Joan in marriage, first promised to one prince and then given to another as her father's interest dictated, was no peculiar cruelty aimed at her alone, but the common fate of every high-born girl of her age. And it is worth understanding the system that governed her, for it ruled her early life as it ruled the lives of all such daughters. A princess, in that world, was not a person who might choose her own path, but an asset of her house, a precious counter in the endless game of alliances by which the great families of Europe knit themselves together and advanced their fortunes. Her hand was a thing of value, to be bestowed where it would bring the most advantage, and her wishes in the matter counted for nothing at all. From her cradle, she was a piece to be played. Betrothed, while still a child, to whatever match served her family's purpose, and married off, when the time came, to a husband chosen, for reasons of state, in which her own happiness had no part. It was a hard system, judged by the feelings of those caught in it, and yet it was not, by the lights of the age, a cruel one. For it was simply the way the world worked, accepted by all and questioned by none. The daughters who were bartered in this fashion did not, for the most part, expect anything else. They had been reared to it, schooled from infancy in the knowledge that their marriages would be made for them and that duty, not desire, would settle their fate. Some of these arranged matches turned out well, ripening into real affection between strangers thrown together by policy. Others were cold and wretched bargains endured for a lifetime. But well or ill, they were the daughter's lot. And the girls who lived them had no more say in the matter than they had in the weather. Joan was reared in this knowledge like all her kind, and bore the disposing of her hand, first to the Spanish prince, and then to the Breton duke, with the resignation that her age expected of her. What lifts her story a little above the common run is what came after, for Joan, having been bartered in the usual way for her first marriage, contrived for her second to marry where her own heart inclined. Her union with the sovereign of England was no bargain struck by counsellors over her head, but a match of her own choosing, the fruit of an affection she had formed, and then, when she was free, deliberately pursued. And in choosing it, she showed a degree of agency that the system seldom allowed its daughters. She had been a piece in the game when she was young and powerless, but as a widowed duchess, a ruler in her own right, she became for once a player and played her own hand and chose her own husband, paying for the choice the terrible price of her children, but making it, all the same, herself. It is a small thing perhaps, but a telling one, that the woman who had been disposed of, like all her kind, seized, when she could, the rare chance to dispose of herself, and it tells us something of the spirit in her that the system had not managed to crush. It is worth pausing on the age into which Joan was born, for the 14th century was one of the most calamitous in the whole history of Europe. 100 years of disaster, heaped upon disaster, and the world of her childhood was one that had been shaken to its foundations. The greatest of these calamities had come a little before her birth, in the form of the most terrible pestilence that the continent had ever known, the famous plague that men would afterward call the Black Death. It had swept out of the east and across the whole of Europe in a few horrifying years, killing without mercy or distinction, carrying off perhaps a third or even a half of all the people of the continent, emptying villages, silencing towns, and leaving behind it a world that was smaller and poorer and more haunted than the one it had struck. The memory of that horror lay over the whole age like a shadow, a knowledge that death could come suddenly and on a scale beyond imagining, and it bred in the living a grim familiarity with mortality that we can scarcely conceive. If the pestilence was the chief horror of the age, it was far from the only one. These were the years of the Great Schism in the Western Church, when rival claimants to the throne of St. Peter hurled their curses at one another across Christendom and split the loyalty of every realm, so that men could not be certain which of two popes held the keys of heaven, and the very rock on which their faith was built seemed to crack beneath them. These were the years, too, of terrible risings of the common people, driven to fury by their miseries and their burdens, that blazed up in one land after another and were drowned in blood, of famines that came at the heels of failed harvests, of a general unsettling of the old order that had bound the medieval world together. The certainties of an earlier age, the confident trust in a stable and a God-ordered creation, were crumbling everywhere, and men felt the ground shifting beneath them and knew not what fresh disaster the coming season might bring. Into this hard and frightening world Joan was born, and it shaped her as it shaped all her generation. She grew up knowing that fortune was a wheel that turned without mercy or warning, that the mightiest could be cast down overnight, and the most secure left ruined, that plague and war and treachery might at any moment overturn the whole order of a life. It was a knowledge that bred either despair or resilience, and in Joan it bred resilience, the hard-won steadiness of one who expects the worst and is braced to endure it. Few women of any age have had that steadiness tested, as hers would be tested, across a life that carried her through more upheaval than most whole dynasties suffer. And the bracing she had received from her hard century, the deep expectation of trouble that was the gift of her dangerous times, was part of what carried her through. The match that was at last made for her, when she was about 16 years of age, sent her far from the mountains of her birth, away to the green and rainy duchy of Brittany on the far western edge of France, where the land runs out into the grey Atlantic. For Joan was given in marriage to the ruler of that proud and half-independent country. John, the Duke of Brittany, a man of power and consequence, who governed his sea-girt duchy almost as a king in his own right, holding the balance between England and France in the long wars, and answering, when it suited him, to neither. He was a brilliant match, the lord of one of the mightiest fiefs in all of France, but he was also a man old enough to be the girl's father, for the Duke was some 30 years her senior, a hardened veteran of war and politics in his late 40s, while Joan was a maiden of 16. And she was not his first wife, nor his second, but his third. For the Duke had buried 2 English wives before her, both of them daughters or kinswomen of the English royal line, and had got no surviving heir from either. To this much married, much older man, a stranger twice her age in a far country, the girl was sent to be a wife, as royal daughters were sent, with no more say in the matter than she had ever had in anything. We might expect such a marriage to have been a cold and a wretched thing, the yoking of a girl to an elderly stranger, for reasons of pure policy, and perhaps in its beginnings it was. But by every sign that reaches us, the union of Joan and the old Duke proved, against the odds, a real and a working marriage, and in time something more than that. For her part, whatever her private feelings on being handed to a man so much her elder, she brought to her new station the same steady competence that would mark her whole life, taking up the duties of a Duchess of Brittany with a grace and a capability that won her a real place in her husband's regard and her adopted country's affection. The Duke, for his part, found in his young third wife what his 2 English wives had never given him, not only companionship, but children. The heirs his blood had long wanted, for where the others had failed, Joan proved abundantly fruitful, and gave the aging Duke the family he had despaired of. Whatever had brought them together, the marriage took root and bore fruit, and the girl from the mountains of Navarre became in earnest the Duchess of Brittany, mistress of a great court on the edge of the Western Sea. The realm that Joan married into had been won not many years before, in one of the bloodiest and most drawn-out struggles of the age, and the manner of its winning is worth the telling. For it shaped the husband she was given, and the world her children would inherit. A generation before her marriage, the old line of the Dukes of Brittany had failed of a clear heir, and 2 contenders had risen to dispute the rich inheritance, each with his party and his backers, plunging Brittany into a long and a ruinous war of succession. On the one side stood the house into which Joan would marry, the line of Montfort, claiming the duchy by male descent. On the other stood a rival, who held by a different reckoning, supported by the power of France, which was glad of any pretext to fasten its grip upon the wealthy land. And because France took up the one cause, England took up the other, so that the quarrel of the 2 Breton houses became a part of the greater quarrel of the 2 crowns, a lesser war, folded inside the long agony of England and France. For more than 20 years, the war dragged on, a weary cycle of sieges and skirmishes and shifting fortunes, the country torn between the rival lords and their foreign patrons, the wretched Bretons caught in the middle as their country was fought over by others. Joan's husband, the man she would one day marry, was a child of this long war, the son of the Montfort contender, raised in part at the English court that backed his family's cause, and bound from boyhood to the weary struggle for his inheritance. He grew up a soldier and a survivor, hardened in the school of that endless war, learning the arts of the borderland prince who must steer between mightier powers, and in the end, after decades of strife, his cause prevailed. The rival fell at last upon a stricken field, and the House of Montfort came into the prize it had bled so long to win. So Joan's husband became the Lord of Brittany by right of conquest as much as descent, the victor of a generation's war, master at last of the prize his family had fought for since his childhood. There is an irony in this history that bears upon Joan's own story, for the duke she married had owed his throne to English friendship, raised at the English court and set in his duchy by English arms against the power of France. He had spent his life leaning toward England, the patron of his house, even as he guarded his independence against both his mighty neighbours. And he had taken, before Joan, 2 English wives, daughters of the island kingdom, that had backed his cause. It is a strange turn, then, that his widow should have gone on to become herself a Queen of England, marrying into the very kingdom that had made her first husband a duke. And stranger still, that the son she bore, that English-backed duke, should grow up to fight against England with all his strength, becoming one of the chief architects of England's defeat in France. The wheel of those entangled loyalties turned through Joan's whole life, and beyond it, England, the friend of her first husband and the prison of her old age, the maker of the father and the enemy of the son, and she stood, as ever, at the crossing point of it all, a woman whose every tie seemed to bind her to both sides of a quarrel at once. The Brittany in which she now made her life was a country worth pausing over, for it was unlike anything she had known in her mountain childhood. A land of grey skies and green fields, and a long wild coastline beaten by the Atlantic, peopled by a proud Celtic folk with their own ancient tongue and their own fierce sense of themselves. The duchy was one of the great prizes of the age, a rich and a populous land set at the meeting point of the struggle between England and France, courted and threatened by both. Its dukes forever steering a perilous course between the 2 mighty powers that each longed to swallow them. Joan's husband was a master of that dangerous game, a duke who had spent his life balancing between the English and the French, leaning now to one and now to the other, fighting to keep his duchy free of both. And in this, of course, he was much like the father Joan had left behind in Navarre, another ruler of a borderland kingdom living by his wits between mightier neighbours. The girl who had been bred in the hard school of Navarre was well fitted, perhaps, to be the wife of such a man, for she understood in her bones the art of survival between the millstones, the patient, watchful statecraft of the small power caught among the great. As Duchess of Brittany, she came into a position of real consequence and real work, for the consort of so mighty a prince was no idle ornament, but a partner in the governing of a country. She kept a splendid court, presided over the ceremony and the hospitality that proclaimed her husband's greatness, and bore her part in the endless business of a ducal household and a ducal government. More than that, she seems to have won, in her years in Brittany, a genuine place in the affections of her adopted people, a thing not always granted to a foreign-born duchess, for the Bretons, by the signs that remain, took their Navarre's duchess to their hearts, and would remember her with regard long after she had left them. She was learning, in these years, the trade she would practice all her life, the trade of the noble lady and the ruler's consort, the keeping of state and the management of men, and the patient exercise of influence behind a husband's throne. It was an apprenticeship that would serve her well, for the day was not far off when she would have to rule Brittany not as a duke's wife, but in her own hand, as regent for a child, and the skills she gathered now, in the green years of her first marriage, were the skills that would carry her through all the storms ahead. The duchy that became Joan's home for 17 years was a world away from the mountains of her birth, and worth a moment's picturing, for she came to know it well, and was, by every sign, content there. Brittany was the great peninsula that juts out from the northwestern corner of France into the cold Atlantic, a land of long indented coasts and rocky headlands, of fishing harbours and walled towns, and a wide green interior of fields and forests and standing stones older than memory. Its people were a proud and a separate folk, the Bretons, a Celtic people cousin to the Welsh and the Cornish across the water, speaking their own ancient tongue and cherishing their own customs and their own fierce independence. As wary of the French who pressed upon them from the east as the Navarres had been of their own great neighbours. It was in that, a country not unlike the one Joan had left, a proud small land determined to keep its own identity against a mightier neighbour, and perhaps that likeness helped the mountain princess to feel at home upon the Atlantic shore. The duchy was rich, and it was strategically vital, set where the sea lanes between England and the south of Europe passed close along its coasts, so that both England and France coveted it, and courted it, and longed to control it. Its dukes ruled almost as kings, holding great state in their castles at Nantes and Vannes, and the other seats of their power, keeping their own courts, and coining their own money, and steering their own course in the wars of the age. Joan's husband was such a duke, a ruler who had fought hard to win and hold his duchy, and who guarded its independence jealously, leaning now toward England and now toward France as the safety of his land required. To be the duchess of such a country was to be the consort of a true power, mistress of a court that mattered in the affairs of the West. And Joan filled the role with the dignity and the skill that marked her. Becoming in her years there a Breton duchess in more than name, beloved, it seems, of the people she had come among. There is something fitting in the thought that Joan, bred in one proud borderland kingdom, should have spent the long middle years of her life in another, that the daughter of mountain Navarre should have become the lady of Atlantic Brittany. Two small, fierce countries clinging to their freedom on the edges of the great. In both she was the foreign-born consort who made herself at home, who learned the art of her adopted land and won the regard of its people. In both she practiced the patient statecraft of the borderland, the watchful weighing of friend and foe that she had drunk in with her mother's milk. It was excellent training for what was to come, though nothing could have trained her fully for the strangeness of her third country. But the woman who would one day be the foreign Queen of England had served already as the foreign Duchess of Brittany, and had learned, in that green and rainy land by the sea, how to be a stranger and yet a mistress, an outsider and yet a power, in a country not her own. To be a duchess in that age, the consort of a ruling prince, was to hold an office of real substance, and it is worth understanding what Joan's days were filled with in her Breton years. For the skills she gathered then were the skills of her whole life. A great lady of her rank was no mere decoration upon her husband's arm. She was the mistress of a vast household, the manager of a moving establishment of hundreds of souls, the keeper of her lord's hospitality, and the overseer of all the intricate domestic economy that fed and clothed and housed so great a company. She presided over the ceremony that proclaimed her husband's grandeur, received the guests and the envoys and the petitioners who came to the ducal court, and bore her part in the unending round of display and observance by which the power of a prince was made visible to the world. It was demanding work, requiring intelligence and energy and a sure command of the arts of management, and Joan, by every sign, did it well. Beyond the household lay the wider sphere of sway and intercession that was open to a capable consort. And here too, Joan seems to have found her feet. A duchess could be a power behind her husband's throne, a counsellor in his ear, an advocate for those who sought her favour, a maker of peace in quarrels and a smoother of difficulties. She could wield, through the soft arts of persuasion and connection, a real hand in affairs, the more effective for being indirect. And in the patronage of religion and learning, in the founding and endowing of churches, and the support of holy houses, and the works of charity that became a noble lady, she could leave a mark upon her country that outlasted her. Joan moved in all these spheres, the household and the court, and the works of piety, and the quiet exercise of sway, learning the whole trade of the princely consort, the trade she would carry from Brittany to England and practice in the end as a queen. It was an apprenticeship, all of it, though she did not know it, for the greater roles that lay ahead. The girl who had been a piece in her father's games became in Brittany a mistress of households and a force in a court, and in time a ruler in her own right. And every skill she gathered, every art of management and influence and endurance, would be called upon again in the harder school of her English years. We should not picture her Breton years as idle or ornamental. They were years of real work and real growth, the making of the capable woman who would later need all her capability merely to survive. And when we come to admire the steadiness with which she bore her later trials, we should remember that the steadiness was built here, in the long laborious years of her duchess's apprenticeship by the Western Sea. It is worth lingering for a little on the splendour amid which a lady like Joan passed her days, for the courts she presided over, first in Brittany and later in England, were places of a rich and a sensuous beauty that it is pleasant to dwell upon as the night draws on. The hall of a great prince was a world of colour and warmth and display, its stone walls hung with broad tapestries woven in wool and silk, glowing with scenes of hunt and battle and old romance, softening the cold stone and telling their slow stories to the eye. Underfoot in the chambers were strewn fresh rushes mingled with sweet herbs, lavender and meadowsweet, that released their fragrance as they were trodden, and everywhere the light of candles and of roaring fires played upon shining surfaces, upon carved wood and painted beam, and the gleam of precious things. The table of such a court was a marvel of its own, for the feasting of the mighty was an art and a display as much as a nourishment. There would be vessels of gold and silver upon the board, cups and salts and chargers worked by fine craftsmen, catching the firelight. There would be dishes of a richness and an elaboration that the modern table can scarcely conceive. Meats, roasted and spiced and dressed in sauces, bright with saffron and ginger and the costly spices of the East, brought at vast price along the trade roads of the world. The cooks of a princely household laboured to amaze as well as to feed, contriving wonders of pastry and sugar, dishes coloured and gilded and shaped into wonders, so that a feast was a theatre for the eye before it was a pleasure for the tongue. And through it all ran the sound of music, the minstrels in the gallery filling the hall with the sweet noise of harp and pipe and viol, the soft accompaniment to the slow ceremony of the feast. The dress of such a court matched its halls and its tables, for richness, for clothing in that age, was the chief mark of rank and wealth, and the highborn went clad in a magnificence that proclaimed their station to every eye. There were robes of fine wool and shimmering silk, of velvet and of cloth woven through, with threads of real gold lined and trimmed with costly furs against the cold, the ermine and the miniver that only the highest might wear. There were jewels and chains and brooches of gold, girdles set with gems and headdresses of intricate and towering fashion. A queen like Joan moved through her days in such array, a figure of studied splendour, her very garments, a statement of her rank and a part of the proud theatre of monarchy. It was a world built to delight the senses and to overawe the beholder, a world of warmth and colour and sweet sound and rich savour, and it is a gentle thing to picture the foreign queen moving through it. Amid the candlelight and the tapestries and the slow music, in the bright years before her troubles came. The days of a great household in Joan's age moved to a slower and a steadier rhythm than any we know, governed not by the clock, which had scarcely come into the world, but by the turning of the light and the ringing of the bells, and it is a soothing thing to follow that gentle round as the night deepens. The day began at first light, or before it, for people rose with the dawn and slept with the dark, their waking hours bounded by the sun in a way that our own age, with its lamps that turn night into day, has wholly forgotten. In the grey of the early morning, the house stirred and woke, the fires were built up from the embers, the day's business began, and almost the first act of the waking company, before any food was taken, was the hearing of Mass. The whole company gathering in the chapel, in the cold, to begin the day with prayer, as the age thought right and proper. Through the morning the work of the house went forward, each to his office and his task, while the great lady saw to the ordering of her affairs, received those who sought her, and bore her part in the running of her little kingdom of servants and officers. The bells of the hours marked the passage of the hours, the ancient round of prayer that divided the day in every Christian land, rung out from church and chapel to call the devout to their devotions at the appointed times. And by these bells, rather than by any dial, men measured out their days, knowing the hour by the office that was being sung. The chief meal came not in the evening, as with us, but in the middle of the day, a hearty dinner taken late in the morning or at noon, the chief feeding of the company, after which the afternoon stretched away toward the failing of the light. As the day waned toward evening, there came a lighter meal, the supper, taken before the dark closed in, and then, as the daylight failed and the costly candles could not long hold it back, the house drew toward its rest. There was no keeping of late hours in that age, for candles were precious and the night was long, and when night came, the natural thing was to seek one's bed and sleep until the dawn returned. The fires were banked, the company settled. The still house grew quiet under the stars, and the lady of it, her days round complete, withdrew to her own chamber and her own rest, to lie down in the deep darkness of a medieval night, a blackness fuller and quieter than any we know, unbroken by any glimmer but the moon and the dying fire. The seasons, too, laid their own slow rhythm over the round of the days. For a house such as Joan's lived close to the turning of the year in a way the modern world has lost. In the short, dim days of winter, the candles burned longer and the fires roared higher, and the company drew in upon itself against the cold. The dark evenings passed in the warm hall, with music and talk, and the telling of old tales. In the lengthening days of spring and summer, all opened out again. The riding and the hunting and the business of the wider estate, filling the longer hours of day. The great feasts of the church marked the turning of the year, the solemn fasts and the joyful festivals that broke the round of ordinary days, each with its own customs and its own foods and its own observances. And between them ran the steady ordinary days, each, like the last, the slow unchanging rhythm of a life lived by the light and the bell. It was a way of living unhurried and deeply settled, rooted in the turning of the sun and the seasons, and there is a deep peace in it that our restless age might envy. It is a peaceful thing to think of, that slow old rhythm of waking and working and praying and resting, bounded by the sun and hallowed by the bells. The gentle round of days that Joan knew in the bright years of her duchy and her queenship, before the wheel of her fortune turned toward its grimmer quarter. And it is a fitting thought to carry down toward sleep. The image of a whole house settling into the night with the setting of the sun, as we too settle now into the quiet of the night. But the heart of her life in Brittany, as the heart of any noble lady's life in that age was the bearing and raising of children. And here, Joan was abundant, where her predecessors had been barren. Over the years of her marriage to the old duke, she bore him a large family, a whole nursery of sons and daughters. 9 children in all, by the count that has come down to us, where his 2 English wives had given him none that lived. It was the supreme service a wife could render, the securing of the line, and Joan rendered it in full measure, filling the ducal nursery with heirs and providing for the future of her husband's line. First among her children was the boy who would carry on the dukedom, another John, the eldest son and heir, who would in time rule Brittany after his father, and there came another son, Arthur, who would grow into one of the most remarkable men of his age, a famed soldier and statesman whose long and brilliant career would carry him to the very summit of the affairs of France. Though all of that lay far in the future, there were daughters too, to be married off in their turn into the first houses of France, and the other sons besides, a full and a thriving brood. Joan was, in these years, what the age most prized in a great lady, a fruitful wife, and a careful mother, the mother of a flourishing dynasty. And her children would be the firm anchor of her heart through all the upheavals that were to come, the more so because she would one day be forced to make a choice concerning them that few mothers are ever asked to make. The chief labour of Joan's Breton years, and the one that mattered most to her husband and his house, was the bearing of children, and here she succeeded where others had failed, in a way that shaped her whole standing in the duchy. Her husband, the old duke, had been married twice before, both times to ladies of the English royal house, and from neither of those marriages had he got a living heir. His line stood in real danger of failing, and the want of a son was the chief anxiety of his later years. Then he married the young Princess of Navarre, and against all his disappointed hopes, she proved richly fruitful, giving him not one heir, but a whole nursery of them, sons to carry on his dukedom and daughters to make alliances with, securing at a stroke the future of his dynasty. It was the highest service a wife of that age could render, and Joan rendered it in full, and it raised her, in her husband's regard and her duchies, far above the place a foreign bride might ordinarily have held. But we should remember, behind the dynastic triumph, the human reality of what that fruitfulness cost and meant. For childbearing in that age was the great labour and the great danger of a woman's life. Each of the many children Joan bore was a passage through peril, for childbed was the chief killer of women in those times, and no lady, however high her rank, was spared its risks. The queen and the peasant alike went down into that valley of the shadow each time their hour came, and many did not come back. Joan passed through it again and again, and survived, which was itself no small mercy, and saw the most of her children grow, which was a smaller mercy still in an age of fearful infant mortality. The full nursery that secured her husband's line was bought with years of danger and labour, and the constant nearness of death, the ordinary heroism of medieval motherhood. And we should not let the cool language of succession and inheritance hide the courage and the cost that lay behind it. These children were the firm anchor of Joan's heart, and the knowledge of that makes the sacrifice of her second marriage the more wrenching. For when she chose to marry her English king, she chose, as the price of it, to leave these very children behind. The sons she had borne in such danger and raised with such care, the heirs whose coming had made her place in Brittany secure, she gave up to other hands and sailed away from, in the hardest bargain of her life. It is one thing to read that a queen surrendered the guardianship of her children for reasons of state. It is another to remember that those children were the fruit of her body and the labour of her years, born in peril and reared in love, and that to leave them was to tear out a part of her own heart. The fruitfulness that had been her triumph in Brittany became, in the hour of her second marriage, the measure of her sacrifice. And the mother, who had filled a ducal nursery, sailed for England with only her two youngest daughters, leaving the rest of her children and a part of herself upon the Breton shore. For 13 years she lived as the Duchess of Brittany, wife to the old Duke and mother to his growing children. And then, as it must, the wheel turned, and her first life ended. In the last autumn of the 14th century, the old Duke, full of years and worn by his long and turbulent career, came at last to his death, leaving Joan a widow in her early 30s with a wide brood of young children and a duchy in need of a ruler. For the new Duke, her eldest son, was a child still, far too young to govern in his own right. And so the rule of the land in his minority fell to his mother, and the widowed duchess became the regent, the actual ruler of the country, until her boy should come of age. It was a heavy charge to lay upon a woman newly widowed, the government of a rich and a coveted country, exposed as Brittany always was to the pressure of England and France, and to the ambitions of every neighbouring power. But she took it up with the competence that never seemed to fail her, and ruled the duchy for her son with a steady and a capable hand. For something like 2 or 3 years she governed it in her own right, a reigning duchess in all but name, holding the realm together for her boy and defending his inheritance against all who might think to prey upon a child's weakness. It was the first time she had held real power in her own hand, rather than at her husband's side, and she proved equal to it, as she would prove equal to almost everything that her hard life threw at her. But even as she ruled, a new turning was preparing, for there had come to her court, a little before, an exiled and a landless English lord, and the meeting of those two would change the whole course of her life. When Joan took up the rule of Brittany for her young son, she stepped into one of the few roles of open command that her age allowed to a woman, and it is worth considering what those roles were. For the whole question of a woman's authority runs through her story. The world she lived in was one ruled by men, in which the formal offices of state, the crowns and the commands and the seats of government, were almost wholly reserved to men. And a woman was expected to live under the governance first of her father and then of her husband, a subordinate and a dependent all her days. The law and the custom of the age held women to be the weaker sex, unfit for rule, and barred them from most of the public exercise of rule. A woman who sought to reign in her own right faced the deep resistance of a world that thought her sex incapable of it. And yet, within these hard limits, there were avenues by which a woman of rank and ability might wield real authority, and Joan travelled most of them in the course of her life. A wife might govern through her husband, as his counsellor and his partner and the manager of his affairs. A widow might hold great estates and great wealth in her own hand, a force in the land by virtue of her possessions. And above all, a mother might reign as regent for a son too young to govern, taking up, in the name of her child, the authority that she could never have claimed in her own. This last was the role that custom most readily granted to women, for the regent mother, ruling in trust for her son, threatened no one's sense of the proper order. She ruled not as a woman claiming dominion, but as a mother guarding her child's inheritance. And in that guise, even the most masculine age would suffer a woman to command. Joan filled this role in Brittany, governing the duchy for her boy with skill and resolution, and filled it again, years later, when her English stepson made her regent of his kingdom in his absence. But the authority a woman held in that world, however real, was always a borrowed and a precarious thing, held in trust or through a man or by sufferance. Never wholly her own and never quite secure. A regent ruled only until her son came of age. A dowager held her wealth only so long as no powerful man coveted it. A queen's influence depended on her husband's favour and her people's goodwill. When those supports failed, the woman's power could collapse in an instant, for she had no independent standing to fall back upon, no office that was truly hers, no strength at her own command. Joan learned this hard truth in the end, when her dower was seized and her person imprisoned, and all her wealth and standing swept away at a stroke. For she discovered then how little a woman's authority was worth when the men who controlled the real engines of strength turned against her. The regent of two realms, the Dowager Queen, one of the wealthiest women in England, was undone in a moment when the king resolved upon her ruin, and her fall is the sharpest possible lesson in the fragility of a woman's authority in a world that was, at the last, ruled by the strength of men. The exiled lord, who had come to Joan's court, and whose coming would remake her life, was a man named Henry Bolingbroke, and he was, at the moment of their meeting, a wanderer without a country. A mighty English nobleman who had been driven out of his own land by the monarch he would one day overthrow. He was the son of one of the foremost lords of England, a cousin of the reigning English king, and a man of keen ability and high ambition. But he had fallen foul of his royal cousin, the unstable and suspicious king, Richard II, and had been sentenced to a long banishment from England, sent out to wander the courts of Europe as a landless man. In the course of those wanderings he came, as banished men did, to the courts of the great princes who might shelter or aid him, and so he came to Brittany, to the court of the old Duke and his Navarrese Duchess, and was received there as an honoured guest. And there, in the months of his stay, something passed between the visitor and the Duchess, some spark of regard or affection that both of them would remember. For the chroniclers tell us, looking back, that a warmth grew up between Henry and Joan in those days, the beginning of a bond that neither of them, in that hour, was free to act upon. It was an impossible attraction at the time, and could be no more than that. Joan was a married woman, the wife of the old Duke and the mother of his children. Henry was a banished man with no land and no prospects. His future utterly dark, dependent on the charity of foreign courts. Whatever drew them together had no road open to it, hemmed in on every side by the hard facts of their situations. And yet the regard was there, planted and waiting, and when the situations of both were transformed, as within a few short years they would be, by death and by revolution, the seed that had been sown in those Breton months would come, against all likelihood, to flower. For the wheel was about to turn for both of them at once, lifting the landless exile to a throne and freeing the Duchess by widowhood, and what had been impossible would become, suddenly and astonishingly, possible. It is one of the strange turns of her strange life. This meeting of the Duchess and the Wanderer, two people each bound by their circumstances, each about to be flung by fortune into a wholly new condition, and each carrying away from their brief acquaintance a regard that would one day reshape the map of their lives. The man who would draw Joan across the sea and make her a queen deserves a portrait of his own. For Henry of Bolingbroke was one of the most striking figures of his age, and the bond that grew between him and the Duchess is the more striking when we know what manner of man he was. He came of the highest blood in England, the son of one of the mightiest princes of the realm, a mighty duke, who was himself the son of a famous king and the brother of kings. Through that father Henry stood very near the throne, a prince of the blood royal, rich and powerful, and marked from birth for greatness. And he had made, in his earlier years, a name for himself as a paragon of the knightly virtues. A bold and an accomplished warrior who had travelled to the far corners of Christendom in search of honour and adventure. He had gone crusading in the cold forests of the East, fighting alongside the warrior monks who carried the cross into the pagan lands. He had journeyed as a pilgrim to the holy city itself, far across the sea. He was famed in the lists and the council chamber alike, a man of action and intelligence both, the very model of what a prince should be. But this brilliant and fortunate man had fallen, in the years before he came to Brittany, into a bitter quarrel with the king his cousin, and it had cost him everything. The English king of those days was a strange and a suspicious man, able in some ways but unstable and arbitrary, given to sudden rages and sudden favourites, mistrusted and feared by his great nobles. Henry had become entangled in the deadly politics of that king's court, and in the end the sovereign had turned upon him, sentencing him to a long banishment and driving him out of England to wander the courts of Europe as an exile. So it was as a banished man, stripped of his place, though not yet of his birthright, that Henry came in his wanderings to the court of Brittany, and there met the Duchess who would one day be his queen. He was, at that meeting, a man under a cloud, his future dark, his fortunes at their lowest ebb, and yet there was in him still the bearing and the brilliance of the prince he had been and would be again, and it is no wonder that the Duchess, herself no common woman, found something in him worth remembering. That a bond of real feeling should have formed it all in so brief and so unpromising a meeting tells us something of the quality of both of them, for neither was a person easily impressed. Henry had moved all his life among the foremost figures of Europe, and was not a man to be charmed by a fair face or a high title alone, and the Duchess, mistress of a famous court and no longer a green girl, had seen enough of the world to know its flatteries. Whatever drew the two of them together was something more solid than the idle gallantry of a court, a recognition, perhaps, between two strong and capable natures of a likeness in one another. Two survivors of hard schools who found in each other an unlooked-for kinship. It was a regard built to endure, and endure it did, outlasting years of separation and the wildest reversals of fortune, and when at length the way was clear, it was this durable bond, and not mere calculation, that drew the new-made King of England to send across the sea for the Duchess he had known in his exile. The transformation, when it came with breathtaking speed. While Henry was still abroad, the old English king, his cousin, made the fatal blunder of seizing the vast inheritance that should have come to Henry on his father's death, stripping the banished man of his birthright as well as his country. It was an act of tyranny that frightened and angered the entire English nobility, and it gave Henry both the motive and the occasion to return. He landed in England with a small force, was joined by lords and commons flocking to his banner, and in a matter of weeks had swept the wretched Richard from the throne and taken the crown for himself. The exile become a king. The landless wanderer, who had been a guest at Joan's Breton court, was now Henry IV, King of England, master of one of the great kingdoms of the West. It was a reversal of fortune so sudden and so complete that it might have come out of a romance, and it changed everything. For the man whom Joan had known as a powerless wanderer was now a sovereign in his own right, free, and in want of a queen. For his first wife had died years before, leaving him a widower with a brood of children, but no consort to share his new-won throne. The revolution that carried Henry from exile to the throne, and so set the stage for Joan's English destiny, was one of the chief turning points of English history, and it is worth understanding. For the throne that Henry won was a throne he had usurped, and the shadow of that usurpation would lie over Joan's whole time in England. The king whom Henry overthrew was his own cousin, the strange and arbitrary monarch who had banished him, and the act that brought Henry back was the monarch's own folly, for when Henry's great father died, he, in a stroke of tyranny that appalled the whole nobility, seized the vast estate that should have passed to the exiled son, robbing Henry of his patrimony while he was helpless abroad. It was an act that struck at the security of every great family in the land, for if the king could seize one man's inheritance at will, no man's was safe, and it gave Henry both a burning grievance and a cause that others would rally to. He returned to England with a small band of followers, landing in the north and giving out that he had come only to claim his stolen inheritance. But the whole discontented realm flocked to him, and the wretched king, caught off his guard and deserted by his own people, found his power melting away almost without a blow struck. Within a few weeks, Henry had the sovereign in his hands and the kingdom at his feet. And what had begun as a claim to a lost dukedom ended as a seizure of the crown. The fallen king was forced to give up his throne, and Henry took it and was crowned in his cousin's place. The exile became a king. The deposed monarch did not long survive his fall. He died, a prisoner, within a few months, in circumstances that no one fully explained and many darkly suspected, and the manner of his death hung ever after, as a question mark, over the conscience of the man who had supplanted him. This was the throne that Joan came to share. A throne won by force and shadowed by the deposition and the convenient death of its rightful holder. It was not a secure inheritance. Henry spent the whole of his reign fighting to hold what he had seized, beset by rebellions and conspiracies, haunted by the irregularity of his title and the suspicion that clung to the fate of the king he had replaced. An usurper's crown sat uneasily, and the unease of it touched Joan too, for a king who could not be sure of his own people was a king poorly placed to protect a foreign and an unpopular wife. When Parliament demanded the expulsion of her Breton servants, it was Henry's very insecurity that forced him to yield, unable to defy his subjects for his queen's sake, and the weakness of the Lancastrian title, the original sin of the usurpation, would echo down the years in ways that touched Joan's fortunes more than once. She had married an usurper, and the price of an usurped crown was a perpetual insecurity that no splendour could quite dispel. And at almost the very moment that Henry was seizing his crown, Joan's own situation was transformed by the death of her old husband, so that within the same season the exile became a king and the wife became a widow, and the two whom circumstance had kept apart found themselves both, suddenly, free. We need not imagine that a marriage between them was an easy or an obvious thing even then, for great obstacles remained, of distance and of policy, and of the deep reluctance of two countries to see their interests entangled. But the essential bar was gone. The impossible had become merely the difficult, and the regard that had been planted in the Breton months now had a road, however hard, along which it might travel. It would take some years yet, and much careful negotiation, before that road could be walked to its end. But the thing was set in motion from the moment that death and revolution between them set the Duchess and the monarch free, and the unlikeliest of love matches, between a Princess of Navarre and an usurping King of England, began its slow approach to fulfilment. Yet before that fulfilment could come, Joan was called upon to make a sacrifice so painful that it stands as perhaps the hardest passage in her whole hard life. For the price of marrying her king was the giving up of her children. She could not, as a practical matter, be both the regent of Brittany and the Queen of England. The two stations were impossible to hold at once, divided by the sea and by the bitter rivalry of England and France. And more than that, she could not take her sons with her to England, for the heir of Brittany could not be reared in the land of his duchy's great enemy. Nor would the Bretons or the French ever suffer the boy duke to pass into English hands. If Joan was to marry Henry and go to him in England, she must leave her sons behind, surrender her regency, and entrust her boys and her country to other hands, parting from the children she had borne and raised, very possibly forever. It was a cruel choice to set before a mother, the choice between her children and the man she wished to marry, and the fact that she made it as she did tells us something perhaps of the strength of what drew her to Henry, and something too of the hard clear-sightedness that ran in her blood. She made her arrangements with the care and the competence that marked everything she did. She negotiated the surrender of the regency and the guardianship of her sons into safe and powerful hands, settling the government of Brittany and the keeping of the young duke upon a mighty prince who could be trusted to defend the boy's inheritance. She set the affairs of her duchy in order, provided as best she could for the children she was leaving, and made ready to depart from the country that had been her home for some 17 years. The country where she had been a wife and a mother and a ruler, for a new land and a new husband and a wholly new life. She would take with her only her 2 youngest daughters, the girls being of no consequence to the Breton succession and free to follow their mother. The sons, the heirs, must stay. It is hard, across the centuries, not to feel the weight of that parting, the Duchess setting sail for England and leaving her boys upon the Breton shore, knowing that she might never look upon them again. Whatever else may be said of Joan of Navarre, she paid a high price for her second marriage, higher than most women are ever asked to pay, and she paid it, by every sign, with open eyes. The arrangements by which Joan gave up her sons and her country to follow Henry to England are worth setting out, for they show both the cruelty of her sacrifice and the careful competence with which she met it. The Duchy of Brittany was a Montfort possession, won by her late husband's house in a long and bloody war of succession, a generation before, and held against the rival claims of another family and the constant pressure of the French crown. The boy duke, her son, was the heir to that hard-won duchy, and his safety and his rights were a matter of the gravest weight. Joan could not take him to England, for the heir of Brittany, reared in the land of England, would be a hostage and a scandal, both intolerable to the Bretons and the French alike. Nor could she rule it as regent from across the sea as the Queen of England. If she was to marry Henry, the boy and the duchy must be left in other, trustworthy hands. The prince she chose as the shield of her son's birthright was no minor lord, but one of the towering figures of the age. A duke of the French blood royal, whose vast power and high standing made him a guardian no one would lightly cross, and whose own interest it was to keep the young duke's rights intact. To such a protector, bound by the most solemn oaths to uphold the ancient laws and liberties of Brittany, she could commit her boy with as much confidence as the cruel necessity allowed. She was not abandoning him to chance, but lodging him in the strongest hands the politics of the moment could supply. It was the act of a mother who, even in the agony of parting, kept her wits about her and bargained shrewdly for her child's safety, wringing from a hard past the best protection it could yield. And having done all that foresight could do, she turned at last to the bitterest part of the business, the leave-taking itself. We should not let the competence of the arrangements hide the anguish that must have lain beneath them. Joan was leaving the children of her body, the sons she had borne in peril and raised in love, very probably forever. She was sailing away from the country that had been her home for the better part of 2 decades. The land where she had been a wife and a mother and a ruler, for a new husband and a new crown and a wholly uncertain future. That she did it with such care and such clear-sightedness, providing for what she left even as she tore herself from it, does not lessen the pain of it, but rather deepens our sense of the woman, who could feel so much and yet act so wisely, who could give up her children and still think, in the giving, of how best to keep them safe. It was the hardest bargain of her life, and she drove it with her eyes open and her head clear, and paid the price of it, as she paid every price life asked of her, without flinching and without complaint. The crossing to England, when at last she made it in the depth of winter, was a rough and a stormy one. The narrow seas between France and England, living up to their evil reputation and tossing the royal bride upon a wild passage. It was an unquiet beginning, and some looked back upon it afterward as an omen. For Joan's reception in her new country would prove every bit as troubled as her voyage to it. But she came through the storm, as she came through so much, and set foot at last upon English soil. The Princess of Navarre and Dowager Duchess of Brittany come to be the Queen of England. Her marriage to Henry was solemnized with all due ceremony at the ancient cathedral city of Winchester in the early part of the year. The exile and the Duchess, who had met so many years before in a far country, now joined at last as King and Queen, and a little later she made her formal entry into the capital and was crowned with the crown of England, anointed and enthroned as Queen of the realm. The girl from the mountains of Navarre, who had been a duchess by the Western Sea, was now a queen, the consort of one of the mightiest kings of the age, raised to a height that her hardest childhood dreams could scarcely have reached. It should have been the summit of a fortunate life. That it proved instead the doorway to her bitterest trials was no fault of hers, but the work of the suspicious and unwelcoming land into which her strange destiny had carried her. The stormy passage that carried Joan to England, and that men remembered afterward as an omen of the troubles that awaited her there, was no light matter in that age, for the sea was a fearful road, and the narrow waters between France and England were among the most treacherous that travellers of the time were called upon to cross. The ships of that day were small and frail by any later measure. Wooden vessels driven by sail and dependent wholly upon the wind and the weather, with no power to make headway against a contrary gale and no shelter from the fury of a storm. To go down to the sea in such a ship was to put oneself into the hands of fortune and the elements, trusting to luck and to the skill of the mariners to come safe to the far shore. And many who made the attempt did not come safe, but were wrecked upon the rocks or swallowed by the waves or driven helplessly off their course into unknown waters. The narrow sea that Joan had to cross was especially dreaded, for its waters were shallow and its currents strong, and its weather wildly changeable, so that a passage that might be made in a few fair hours could become, when the wind rose, a nightmare of days. The little ship tossed and battered, and flung about upon the heaving grey waste, its passengers sick and terrified and praying for deliverance. It was upon such a passage that Joan came to her new kingdom, crossing in the depth of winter, when the seas were at their worst, and her voyage lived up to all the terrors of that crossing. A wild and a stormy ordeal that tossed the royal bride upon the waves, and tried her courage to the full. She came through it, as she came through so much, but the memory of it stayed with men. And when her later troubles came upon her, there were those who looked back to that stormy arrival and saw in it a sign, a dark foretelling of the unquiet welcome and the bitter end that the island kingdom held in store for its foreign queen. We may let the superstition pass, but the ordeal was real, and it is worth pausing on as a reminder of how hard a thing it was, in that age, simply to travel, simply to move oneself from one country to another across the perilous roads and seas of the medieval world. Joan was a great traveller by the measure of her time, a woman who crossed and recrossed half of Europe in the course of her life, from the mountains of Navarre to the shores of Brittany to the throne of England. And every one of those journeys was an undertaking of real danger and real hardship, a venture across bad roads and worse seas in conditions that the modern traveller can scarcely imagine. The stormy crossing to England was only the most dramatic of her many journeys, the one that men remembered, but behind it lay a whole life of travel and displacement, of farewells and arrivals and the long, hard roads between. The restless wandering that was the outward shape of her restless and much-tried life. The crowning of a Queen of England was a solemn and a dazzling rite, the most solemn ceremony that could be performed upon a woman in that realm. And Joan passed through it in the Abbey at Westminster, a little after her wedding, becoming by its ancient magic not merely the king's wife, but a consecrated queen. The heart of the rite was the anointing, the touching of the queen's body with holy oil by the hands of the chief bishop of the land, for it was believed that this holy unction set the consecrated apart from common mortals, marking them with a kind of holiness and binding them to God in a singular covenant. To be hallowed in this way was to be lifted, in the belief of the age, above the ordinary run of humankind, made a consecrated person whose body was blessed and whose office was blessed of heaven. And Joan, kneeling beneath the bishop's hands in the dim and incense-heavy abbey, was raised by that touch into the small and sacred company of the crowned and hallowed queens of England. After the anointing came the crowning itself, the setting of the golden crown upon her head, and the giving into her hands of the other tokens of her new dignity, the sceptre and the rod and the ring, each with its own meaning and its own solemn words. Robed in rich vesture, crowned and sceptred, she was enthroned before the assembled lords and prelates of the realm, presented to her new people as their anointed queen. While the choirs sang and the church blazed with candlelight, and the ancient words of the rite rolled through the vaulted spaces overhead. It was a moment of supreme exaltation, the summit of all the honour that the world could offer to a woman, the foreign princess raised before the eyes of a kingdom to the highest place a woman might hold in it. And whatever coldness awaited her in the country at large, on this day at least, she was the centre of all eyes, the crowned queen in her glory. After the solemn rite came the feasting, for a coronation was a festival as well as a sacrament, and the day ended in a sumptuous banquet in the vast hall of the palace, where the new queen sat in state amid the splendour of her court, while the realm did honour to its sovereign lady. There would have been all the pageantry of a medieval feast, the long tables groaning with rich and elaborate dishes, the ceremonial service of the courses, the music and the display, and the ancient customs by which such occasions were marked. For one shining day, the foreign queen was the honoured heart of her new kingdom, feasted and celebrated and set on high. And if the brightness of that day was not to last, if the suspicion and the coldness would close in soon enough, the memory of it remained, the day when Joan of Navarre was hallowed and crowned and enthroned a Queen of England, in all the solemn splendour that the old rite could bestow. The crown that Joan now wore carried with it a particular role and a particular place, the office of Queen Consort, and it is worth understanding what that station was, for it shaped both her opportunities and her perils in her new country. A Queen of England was not a ruler in her own right. She held no formal power of government, made no laws, commanded no armies, and stood always in the shadow of her husband the king. But her station was far from empty, for the queen was a great figure of state, nonetheless the first lady of the realm, the partner of the sovereign in the splendour and the ceremony of monarchy, and the holder of a recognised and an honoured rank in the life of the kingdom. She had her own large household and her own revenues, her own estate and dignity. She was expected to be a patroness of religion and learning and charity, a model of piety and grace, and above all she was looked to as an intercessor, a softening influence at the king's side, one who might temper his justice with mercy and plead the cause of the unfortunate. This role of intercessor was perhaps the Queen's most valued function, for it answered a deep need in the harsh politics of the age. A king must often be stern, must punish and refuse and hold firm, but mercy and forgiveness had their part too, and it was the Queen who could supply them without weakening the monarch, kneeling before her husband to beg pardon for the condemned, lending the grace of her intercession to soften the rigour of his rule. Joan was well fitted for such a part, for she was by nature, it seems, a peacemaker and a reconciler. The same woman who had smoothed the quarrels between her husband and his son, and in happier circumstances she might have filled the role of the gracious intercessor queen to perfection. But the great obstacle in her path was the one she could never overcome, that she was a foreigner in a land that distrusted foreigners, and that distrust poisoned the well of her queenship, making the English see in their French-born queen not a gracious intercessor, but a grasping alien, and turning what should have been a place of honour into a station of suspicion and isolation. For the Queen's office, like all such offices, depended on the goodwill of those around it, and goodwill was the one thing Joan could never win in England. A native queen, the daughter of a loved house, might have made of the consort's role a thing of warmth and influence. The foreign queen, distrusted from the start, found the same role a cold and a friendless eminence. Honoured in form but resented in substance, her every act watched with suspicion, her foreignness a barrier between her and the affection of the people. She held the station faithfully by every sign and filled its forms with dignity. But she could never fill it with the love that alone gives such an office life, for the country withheld that love and would go on withholding it, until in the end its suspicion of her flowered into the monstrous accusation that brought her down. The crown of England was the summit of her fortunes, but it was a cold summit. Swept by the winds of a distrust she had done nothing to earn and could do nothing to dispel. Of all that Joan gave up when she sailed for England, the hardest was her children, and yet she did not come wholly childless to her new land. For she brought with her the two youngest of her daughters, the girls being of no weight in the Breton succession and free to follow their mother where her sons could not. These two young women crossed the sea with their mother into the cold and unwelcoming kingdom, the last remnant of the brood Joan had left behind, and their presence must have been a comfort to her in the lonely early years of her English queenship. A thread of her old life carried into the new, a reminder of the Breton years and the children she had been forced to abandon. We know little of them, for the chroniclers cared as little for the daughters of a queen as for the daughters of anyone else, but we may imagine them at their mother's side in the strange new court. Two Breton girls grown up half in England, sharing their mother's exile and her isolation among a people who did not love them. In time, these daughters were disposed of in marriage, as the daughters of the great always were, settled into the alliances that their rank required. One of them was married into a powerful house of the French nobility, carrying her mother's blood and her father's into the tangled politics of France. So the children that Joan had borne in Brittany were strewn, in the end, across the kingdoms and the factions of her age, her sons ruling or fighting in France and Brittany, her daughters married into the great houses, her blood and her ties spread wide across the warring realms. She had been the mother of a numerous brood, the matriarch of a flourishing line. But her motherhood, like everything else in her life, was marked by separation and loss. Her children parted far from her and from one another, the household she had reared broken up and dispersed by the demands of policy and the accidents of war. There is a quiet sorrow in the thought of Joan's divided motherhood, the children of her body flung across half of Europe, some lost to her behind the wall of the sea, some taken captive, some married away. The close-knit nursery of her Breton years sundered and dispersed by the time her own life drew toward its close. She had given up the most of her children for the sake of her second marriage, and the few she kept were taken from her in their turn by marriage or by distance, until the old queen in her English captivity was as solitary as any woman of her rank could be, her kindred present to her only in memory and in the occasional cold comfort of a letter or a report from far away. The mother of 9 ended her days alone in a foreign land, her children gone to the winds, and that loneliness, the price of all her choices and all her misfortunes, was perhaps the heaviest of the many burdens that her hard life laid upon her. From almost the first day of her queenship, Joan found herself a stranger in a suspicious land, for the English did not want her and did not trouble much to hide it. She was a foreigner, to begin with, and the English of that age were a deeply insular people, wary of strangers and quick to resent the elevation of an outsider over them. But worse than her foreignness was her particular origin, for she came out of Brittany, a country bound up with France, and France was the old and bitter enemy against whom England had been waging its long and ruinous wars for generations. To the English eye, their new queen was half a Frenchwoman, sprung from the hostile world across the narrow sea, and her very presence on the throne stirred the deep distrust that the endless war had bred. The bad feeling was sharpened, in those first days, by an unlucky chance, for at almost the moment of her wedding, a ship out of Brittany fell upon English vessels in the Channel, a reminder to suspicious minds that their queen's old country was no friend of theirs. She had come to a land that received her coldly, and the coldness would not thaw. What turned suspicion into real resentment was the matter of her foreign servants, for Joan, like any great lady of her age, had brought with her from her own country a household of attendants and officers, Bretons and others of her own folk, the familiar faces of home in a strange land. To the English, this foreign retinue was an offence and a grievance, a swarm of grasping outsiders battening upon the realm, taking the places and the profits that Englishmen coveted for themselves. The resentment grew so loud that it reached the Parliament of the realm, and in the end a remarkable thing was done, for Parliament moved to expel the Queen's foreign servants from the kingdom, to strip her of the household she had brought from home and send her own people away. And the king, her husband, for all his affection for her, did not feel strong enough to stand against it, for his own hold upon his usurped throne was never wholly secure, and he could not afford to defy his parliament for the sake of his wife's Breton servants. So Joan was made to suffer the sending away of her own folk, the familiar companions of her exile, left more alone than ever in a land that did not love her. It was a bitter early lesson in the price of her crown, and a foretaste of the greater isolation that her later years would bring. The England into which Joan came as queen was a troubled and an uneasy kingdom, and the troubles of it pressed hard upon her own situation, so that it is worth pausing on the state of the realm she had married into. Her husband's throne, as we have seen, was an usurped one, and the whole of his reign was a long struggle to hold it against those who challenged his right or coveted his crown. Scarcely a year of it passed without a rebellion or a conspiracy. The great northern lords, who had helped him to the throne, turned against him and had to be put down in blood. A long and draining revolt flared up in the mountainous west of his kingdom and defied him for years. Plots and risings dogged his steps, and the shadow of the sovereign he had deposed, and who had died in his keeping, never wholly lifted from his name. It was a reign of perpetual insecurity, of a crown held by main force against a world of enemies, and the strain of it told upon the king and upon all around him. This insecurity shaped Joan's queenship in ways both obvious and subtle. It meant, most plainly, that her husband could not always protect her, for a king fighting for his own survival could not afford to spend his strength defending an unpopular foreign wife against the prejudices of his subjects. When his parliament demanded the sending away of her Breton household, his own weakness compelled him to consent. It meant, too, that the whole atmosphere of the court and the kingdom was one of suspicion and faction, of watchfulness and mistrust, an unhealthy air in which a foreign queen with no native following was peculiarly at risk. And it meant that the kingdom's resources were forever strained by the costs of holding the throne and waging the wars, a strain that would, in the next reign, turn the crown's covetous eye upon the wealth of the Dowager Queen herself. Joan had married into a house that held its greatness precariously, by force and against resistance. And the precariousness of it was a danger that surrounded her all her English days. There is a grim irony in her situation when we consider it. She had left the relative security of her Breton duchy, where she was loved and established, to come to a greater throne in a richer kingdom. But the greater throne was an usurped and a contested one, and the richer kingdom was a hostile and a suspicious land, so that in the very act of rising, she had exchanged security for danger and acceptance for distrust. The summit she had climbed to was a cold and a windswept one, a peak swept by every storm of English faction and English prejudice, and she would feel the full force of those storms before her tale was done. The mountain princess who had learned in her cradle the perils of the exposed height found, in the English crown, the most perilous height of all, and the lesson of her childhood, that the high places are the dangerous ones, was written out again in the hard text of her English years. Behind the whole drama of Joan's later life lay the long agony of France, the realm of her mother's blood, which, in these years, tore itself apart in a savage civil war, even as it reeled under the hammer blows of the English, and the ruin of France is worth understanding, for it shaped Joan's fortunes at every turn. The French crown in those days sat upon the head of a king who was mad, sunk for long stretches into a helpless insanity that left the government of his kingdom to be fought over by the princes of his house. And fought over it surely was, with a ferocity that drowned France in blood. Two great parties formed among the royal kinsmen, each led by a mighty duke, and between them they plunged the realm into a war of murder and revenge that raged for a generation, each party slaughtering the other's leaders, each calling in whatever ally it could find, until France was a charnel house of faction, and the old order lay in ruins. Into this self-inflicted wound, the English king drove his sword, for the conquering king, who was Joan's stepson, found in the divisions of France his great opportunity, allying himself now with one side against the other, and using their mutual hatred to conquer what a united France might have defended. The civil war of the French was the true secret of the English triumphs, for a realm at war with itself could not stand against a determined invader, and the victories that made the warrior king's fame were owed as much to French disunion as to English valour. And Joan's own kin were caught up in these divisions on every side, for the prince to whom she had entrusted her sons and her duchy was one of the chief leaders of one party, while she had married a daughter into a house that stood at the very head of the other, so that her children and her connections were strewn across both halves of the bloody quarrel that was tearing France apart. It is a measure of how entangled her life had become in the great quarrels of the age that Joan, the princess of a small mountain kingdom, found her kindred woven into every strand of the catastrophe of France. Her sons under the protection of one party, her daughter married into another, her stepson, the English king, profiting from the ruin of them all. She stood, as she had stood all her life, at the crossing point of mighty forces, a small figure caught among the colliding ambitions of the great, and the war that consumed France reached into her life as it reached into everything in that age, shaping her fortunes, dividing her kin, and forming the dark background against which the strange drama of her own ruin was played out. The witchcraft charge that destroyed her cannot be understood apart from this larger ruin, for it was the conqueror's desperate need of money to feed his French wars that turned his eye upon her dower, and so the agony of France reached out, in the end, to fashion the prison that held the foreign queen. And yet, for all the coldness of the country, the marriage at the heart of it seems to have been a warm one, for whatever England thought of its foreign queen, her husband the monarch appears to have valued her truly, and the union of Henry and Joan, made at last after so many years and so many obstacles, was by the signs that reach us a genuine and an affectionate one. This was no mere match of policy, arranged by counsellors for reasons of state. It was, as far as a royal marriage of that age could be, a marriage of inclination, the fulfilment of the regard that had grown up between the two of them long before in Brittany, and it kept, through the years they had together, a real tenderness. They had no children that lived, which was a sorrow to them both. For it seems that Joan bore the king twins early in the marriage, who did not survive their birth, and no others came after. The queen, who had filled a ducal nursery in Brittany, gave her royal husband no living heir. But if she gave him no children, she gave him companionship and counsel, and a true wife's loyalty, and she found her place too, in the affections of his children, by his first marriage, the sons and daughters of the dead first queen. Here, indeed, Joan showed the warmth and the wisdom of her nature, for she might easily have been a hard or a jealous stepmother to her husband's children, the brood of another woman standing between her and any child of her own. But instead she made herself their friend. Above all, she won the regard of the eldest of them, the sovereign's heir, the bold and brilliant young prince, who would one day be one of the most famous of all English kings, and in the quarrels that arose, as they did, between the aging king and his impatient son, the queen is remembered as having taken the young man's part, smoothing the breaches between father and heir, playing the peacemaker in the royal family. It is a pleasant glimpse of her, this picture of the foreign queen, cold-shouldered by the country at large, making herself beloved within the family she had married into. A good wife to the king and a good friend to his children. It makes the cruelty of what was later done to her by that very stepson, the prince whose part she had taken, all the harder to bear. But that lay far in the future, and for now there was warmth in the royal household, whatever frost lay outside it. Joan was by every sign a devout and a religious woman, as nearly all women of her age and rank were devout, and her piety is worth dwelling on, for it makes the manner of her ruin the more bitterly ironic. The religion of her age was woven through the whole fabric of daily life. Not a thing set apart for holy days, but the very air that all men breathe, governing the calendar and the conscience and the imagination of high and low alike. A great lady like Joan would have ordered her days around the round of prayer and observance, would have kept her own chaplains and her own chapel, would have owned and treasured the beautiful books of devotion that were among the dearest possessions of the wealthy, their pages bright with gold and colour, their prayers worn smooth by daily use. We know that Joan possessed such treasures, richly painted books of psalms and prayers fit for a queen, and we may picture her at her devotions among them, an ordinary pious woman of her time at her prayers, as far from witchcraft and the black arts as it is possible to imagine. At the centre of a high person's religious life stood the confessor, the cleric who heard the private confession of sins and stood, by virtue of that office, in a position of peculiar intimacy and trust. To one's confessor, one opened the secret places of the conscience, confessing the faults and the fears that one hid from all the world besides. He was the keeper of one's deepest privacy, bound by the most solemn obligations to guard what was confided to him, a spiritual father closer in some ways than any friend. It was an office that demanded, and was supposed to guarantee, an absolute trustworthiness. For a priest who betrayed the secrets of the confessional broke the gravest of trusts and committed one of the worst of treacheries. And it was precisely here, at this most intimate and most sacred point of her life, that the blow which destroyed Joan was struck. For the man who accused her, who came before Parliament to brand her a plotter of the monarch's death by sorcery, was none other than her own spiritual father, the very priest to whom she had opened her conscience, the keeper of her soul turned, by some dark bargain or some baser fear, into the instrument of her ruin. There is no uglier detail in the whole ugly business than this, that the accusation came from the confessional itself, that the weapon was forged in the most sacred and trusting of all relationships. Whether the friar acted out of malice, or was bribed or threatened into his treachery, or was himself merely a pawn in the sovereign's larger game, we cannot now know. The records do not tell us what moved him, and his conscience is hidden from us across the centuries. But the bare fact is damning enough, that a devout woman was betrayed by the very priest who heard her confessions. Accused of the blackest of crimes by the man who knew best of all how innocent her conscience truly was. It is a detail that gives the whole affair a peculiar horror. The corruption of the holiest of trusts in the service of a king's greed, and it sets the false charge of witchcraft levelled against a genuinely pious woman by her own spiritual father, among the darkest of the ironies that her dark fortune heaped upon her. The warmth could not last, for the sovereign was failing. Henry IV had seized his crown in the full vigour of his manhood, but the latter years of his reign were darkened by a long and a wasting illness, a disease that disfigured him and broke down his once powerful frame, and that the physicians of the age could neither name with certainty nor do anything to cure. Some terrible affliction of the skin and the flesh fell upon him, so that men whispered of leprosy and worse. And he was seized besides by sudden and frightening attacks that would strike him down without warning, fits that left him for a spell as one dead. For years the king lingered in this broken condition, the splendid usurper of his prime reduced to a sick and a suffering man, and through those wasting years Joan was at his side, the wife of an ailing husband, watching the malady do its slow work upon the man she had crossed the sea and given up her children to marry. It was a grim and a wearing season, the slow dying of a king, and it fell to the queen to share it, as wives must, nursing and comforting and enduring while the end came on by inches. The end came at the last in a manner that men remembered, for the monarch, who had long been troubled in conscience over the throne he had taken by force, was struck down by his final attack, while at his prayers in the great abbey at Westminster, kneeling before the shrine of the holy king who had reigned long before him. They carried him, senseless, into a chamber of the abbot's house nearby, and there, in a room that bore by chance the name of the holy city of Jerusalem, the king came to himself enough to learn that he was dying, and there he died, far from his bed, in the abbey he had come to pray in. By his own wish, he was not laid to rest among the kings at Westminster, but carried to the cathedral at Canterbury, to lie near the shrine of the great martyr saint, whom he had especially revered. And there, in time, his foreign queen would come to lie beside him. For the present, though, his death left Joan a widow once more, a widow for the second time in her life, and this time a widow in a foreign land, far from the children and the country of her birth, dependent now upon the goodwill of the new king who had been her stepson. For a while that goodwill seemed sure, and Joan's widowhood began in security and honour. The new king was the very stepson she had befriended, the bold prince grown now into a formidable and a famous warrior king, and at first he treated his stepmother with every mark of respect and affection. She was a great dowager queen, endowed with a rich provision for her widowhood, one of the wealthiest women in the realm, and the new king, far from resenting her, trusted her so far that when he went off to his wars in France, he left her behind as regent, the guardian of his kingdom in his absence, a mark of trust that showed how high she stood in his regard. For a few years, all was well between them. The dowager queen, honoured and wealthy and secure, the warrior king, her friend and protector. But the wars that the new king waged in France were to be the undoing of that good understanding, for they would set the sovereign against the queen's own blood, and turn the trust between them, by slow and bitter degrees, into the suspicion that would end with the queen in a prison cell. At the root of all that befell Joan in her widowhood lay a single hard fact, the fact of her wealth, and to understand her ruin, we must understand the source of that wealth and why it made her a mark. When a noble lady married, it was the custom to settle upon her a provision for her widow's years, a portion of lands and revenues that would support her in honour should her husband die before her, and that remained hers for her lifetime. And for a queen, This widow's portion, her dower, was on a princely scale, a huge yearly income drawn from estates across the kingdom, enough to maintain a royal state and a royal household to the end of her days. Joan's dower, settled on her at her marriage to the king, was one of the largest such provisions ever granted, a revenue so huge that it made her, in her widowhood, one of the richest persons in the whole realm, richer than most of the mighty lords, mistress of an income that any prince might envy. In the ordinary way of things, this vast wealth was hers by right and beyond the reach of any man, the secure foundation of an honoured and an independent old age. So long as she kept the monarch's favour and gave no cause against herself, her dower was untouchable, guaranteed by law and custom and the solemn settlements of her marriage. It was meant to be the one sure thing in the uncertain life of a widow, the guarantee that she who had been a queen should never want or be beholden. But wealth, in that age as in any, was also a temptation and a danger, and a large fortune in the hands of a friendless foreign widow was a prize that a covetous and a needy king might find hard to resist. Joan's very security was her peril, for the same rich dower that made her independent made her also a target, a treasury walking about in a queen's robes, an income that a king draining his coffers in costly wars might look upon with longing and scheme to seize. And that, in the end, is exactly what happened. For when her stepson the conqueror found his treasury emptied by his French wars and his need for money desperate, his eye fell upon the lush dower of his widowed stepmother, and he found a way to take it. The cry of witchcraft, whatever else it was the instrument by which a coveted fortune was prized from its rightful owner, the legal pretext that allowed the crown to lay its hands upon the queen's revenues and divert them to the king's wars. Strip away the talk of sorcery and conspiracy, and what remains is a simple transaction, the seizure of a rich widow's wealth by a king who wanted it and had the power to take it. Joan's tragedy, in its plainest terms, was the tragedy of being too wealthy and too friendless at once, of holding a vast fortune with no strong hand to defend it. And the dower that should have been the comfort and the security of her old age became instead the bait that drew down upon her the cruelest stroke of her life. The stepson who would imprison Joan and seize her wealth was one of the most famous kings in all of English history, and it is worth taking his measure. For the contrast between his treatment of his stepmother and his towering reputation is one of the sharpest ironies of her story. He had come to the throne on his father's death as a young man in the full vigour of his powers, and he proved at once one of the most formidable rulers the realm had ever known, a warrior of genius and a ruler of iron will and cold efficiency. He was pious in his way, disciplined, austere, utterly dedicated to the consuming enterprise of his reign. The reviving of the Old English claim to the crown of France and the conquest of that kingdom by force of arms. In pursuit of that dream, he led his armies across the sea and won victories that rang through Christendom, humbling the proud power of France, conquering broad provinces, and bringing the French at last to terms that made him heir to the very throne he had set out to take. He was, by the measure of worldly success, among the most triumphant of all English kings, and his fame has only grown with the centuries until he stands in the memory of after ages as the very pattern of the warrior king, the hero of a renowned victory, the conqueror cut off in the flower of his triumph. But the same qualities that made him mighty made him also hard, and there was in him a streak of cold ruthlessness that his admirers have not always cared to dwell upon. He could be merciless in pursuit of his ends, careless of the suffering his wars inflicted, and willing, as the affair of his stepmother shows, to do a grave injustice to an innocent woman for the sake of the money her ruin would bring him. The hero of the famous victory was also the man who jailed a blameless old queen on a trumped-up charge of witchcraft to lay his hands on her fortune. And the two faces of him, the glorious conqueror and the cold despoiler of his stepmother, belong to the same man and must be held together if we are to see him whole. For Joan, the tragedy was sharpened by what had gone before, for this was the very stepson she had befriended and favoured, the bold prince whose part she had taken in his quarrels with his father, the young man she had helped and stood by in the days of her queenship. She had been a true friend to him when he was a prince. He repaid her, when he was a king, with a prison and a slander and the theft of her wealth. There is no uglier passage in the whole story than this: the betrayal of the kind stepmother by the favoured stepson, the conqueror turning upon the woman who had loved him the full weight of his cold and acquisitive power. Whatever the glory of his conquests, this stands against him, indelible, a stain upon the bright legend that no victory can wash away. And those who would see the famous king whole must see beside the hero of the famous battle, the man who broke an old woman's life for gold, for the great enemy that the conqueror went to fight in France was the kingdom in whose service Joan's own children, the sons she had left behind in Brittany, were now grown men and players in their own right. And when the sovereign won his famous and overwhelming victory upon the field in France, the most celebrated of all English triumphs in the long war, among the noble prisoners that his army swept up and carried home was one who touched the queen nearer than any other captive could, for it was her own son, the second of the boys she had left upon the Breton shore so many years before, grown now into a soldier of France and taken fighting against his mother's adopted country. The queen's son was carried a prisoner into England, into the very court where his mother sat as dowager queen, and there occurred a meeting that the chroniclers have handed down as one of the most affecting scenes of that age. For mother and son had not set eyes upon one another for a dozen years and more, since Joan had sailed away from Brittany, leaving her boys behind. The son had been a child at their parting, and was now a grown man and a warrior, and when he was led before the queen and the ladies of her court, the story goes that he could not tell which among them was his mother, so changed was she by the years, until she made herself known to him, and the two of them fell weeping into each other's arms before the whole court. It is a scene to wring the heart, the long-parted mother and son reunited at last, and reunited only because the son had been hauled captive into his mother's land of exile. But the reunion, for all its tears, brought Joan more grief than joy, for her son was a prisoner, and the warrior king would not let him go. However, the queen pleaded for the boy she had lost and found again. The king kept her son in close captivity, shut up in the tower and in other strong castles, refusing to set a ransom or to free him, holding him fast as too valuable a prize to release. For the monarch, it was a matter of cold policy, the keeping of a great enemy prisoner. For the queen, it was the agony of a mother who had recovered her child only to see him locked away, and could do nothing for him but plead in vain. The keeping of her son in chains drove the first wedge between Joan and her royal stepson, souring the trust that had stood between them. And it set the stage, though no one yet knew it, for the dark turn that her fortunes were about to take. For the king who would not free her son was soon to find a use for the queen's great wealth, and the means he found to lay his hands upon it would be the strangest and the cruelest stroke in the whole strange story of Joan of Navarre. The renowned victory that brought Joan's son into his English captivity was the most celebrated feat of arms in all the war between England and France, and it is worth recalling, for it was the hinge on which her later sorrows turned. The warrior king had led his army across the sea to make good his claim in France, and after a hard campaign found himself cornered, his men weary and sick and far outnumbered, by a vast French host that had gathered to destroy him. The two armies met at last upon a muddy field in the autumn. The small English force, footsore and outnumbered many times over, facing the flower of French chivalry, drawn up in overwhelming strength. And by every ordinary reckoning, the English should have been annihilated. Instead, they won one of the most lopsided victories in the history of war. The French cut down in their thousands, while the English losses were few. The proud chivalry of France broken and slaughtered and captured upon the rain-soaked ground. The secret of it lay in the English bowmen, the practiced archers whose long arrows, loosed in their thousands, could pierce armour and bring down horse and man at a distance, and who turned the narrow, muddy field into a killing ground for the heavily armoured French knights. Trapped in the mud, packed too close to move, struck down by the arrow storm before they could come to grips. The French nobility died in heaps or were taken prisoner, and the day ended in a slaughter that left the chivalry of a whole kingdom broken. It was a triumph that made the conqueror's name forever, the proof and the crown of his generalship, the field above all others by which his fame would live. And among the vast host of French prisoners swept up in that overwhelming day, carried back across the sea to captivity in England, was one who touched the English queen more nearly than all the rest. Her own son, the boy she had left in Brittany, grown now into a French soldier and taken on that bloody field, fighting against his mother's adopted land. So the triumph that crowned the stepson's glory brought the stepmother her deepest grief, delivering her long-lost son into the hands of the very king who would soon turn against her. There is a terrible symmetry in it, the same triumph that raised the conqueror to the summit of his fame, casting down the queen who had befriended him. The same battle that filled England with rejoicing, bringing into the queen's life the captive son whose imprisonment would poison her last years. Joan had no part in the bitter quarrel of England and France. Caught as she was between her adopted country and the land of her own children, but the war that she stood athwart reached out and seized her son and broke her peace, and the famous victory that the chronicles celebrate was, for her, the beginning of sorrows. The arrows that won the day on that muddy field flew in a sense into her own heart as well, for they delivered her son to his chains and set in motion the long unravelling of her fortunes. The blow, when it fell, came from the last quarter Joan could have looked for, from a man of her own household, a man whose whole office was the care of her soul. For the accusation that destroyed her peace and stripped her of her freedom was laid not by some open enemy, but by her own confessor, the friar who heard her confessions and stood, of all men, closest to her private conscience. In the autumn of the year, this friar came before the Parliament of the realm and laid against his mistress an accusation so monstrous that it took the breath away, declaring that the Dowager Queen had plotted and schemed for the death and the destruction of the sovereign, her own stepson, in the most evil and the most terrible manner that could be imagined. And the means that were darkly hinted at, the means by which the Queen was said to have compassed the monarch's death, was the most fearful that the age could name, the forbidden art of witchcraft and sorcery, the summoning of evil powers to kill a king by magic. It was an indictment of treason of the deadliest kind, dressed in the robes of the uncanny, and it was hurled against an aging and a foreign and a friendless queen by the very man who should have been the keeper of her secrets. To understand why the accusation laid against Joan was so terrible a weapon, we must understand what witchcraft meant to the people of her age. For the modern mind, which has long ceased to believe in such things, can scarcely grasp the dread that the word once carried. To the men and women of the later Middle Ages, witchcraft and sorcery were not idle fancies, but fearful realities, a genuine and a present danger, the working of harm through the summoning of evil and unseen powers. The age believed, with a whole heart, in a world thronged with spirits good and evil, in the reality of magic and the dark bargains that could be struck with the powers of hell. And it held the practice of such arts to be among the very gravest of crimes, a sin against God and a treason against the natural order, deserving of the harshest punishment the law could inflict. To accuse a person of witchcraft was to reach for one of the most dreadful indictments the age possessed, a thing that touched the deepest fears of every hearer and placed the accused at once under the shadow of the devil. And when the supposed witchcraft was aimed at the person of the monarch, the accusation became deadlier still, for then it was not only sorcery but high treason, the most heinous of all crimes, the compassing of the sovereign's death. To plot a king's murder was a capital crime, whatever the means. To plot it by the black arts, by spells and conjurations and the summoning of fiends, was treason of the most horrifying kind, uniting the terror of the supernatural with the foulest of earthly crimes. This was the accusation laid against Joan, that she had sought the death of the king her stepson by witchcraft and sorcery, and we can see how aptly it was fitted to destroy her. Touching at once the dread of magic and the horror of king murder, branding her in a single stroke as both a creature of the devil and a murderess of kings. It was a charge designed to isolate its victim utterly, to strip away all sympathy and all defense, to make of the accused a figure of universal dread, and against a friendless foreign queen with few to speak for her, it was a thing almost beyond answering. That such a thing could be levelled against a queen at all is a sign of a darkening in the temper of the age, for the fear of witchcraft was growing in those years, swelling toward the terrible witch hunts of later centuries. And the use of the weapon against the mighty, as a tool in the deadly games of politics, was becoming a thing not unknown. Joan was among the first of the royal women of England to feel that stroke, but she would not be the last. Within a generation, another noble lady of the royal house would be brought down by a strikingly similar accusation. Charged with seeking a king's harm by sorcery in a plot, got up for purely political ends. This slander against Joan belongs to this dark and growing pattern, the turning of the age's fear of witchcraft into an instrument of statecraft, a means by which the powerful might destroy their rivals or seize their wealth under cover of a dread that few dared to question. She was the victim of a slander perfectly suited to her age, a lie that drew its terrible force from the deepest fears of her time, and the very strangeness of it, to our eyes, measures the distance between her world and ours. To grasp the force of the accusation, we must enter, for a moment, the mind of the age, which did not doubt for an instant that such powers were possible. The medieval world believed itself surrounded by unseen powers, by angels and demons contending for every soul, by a whole invisible order pressing close upon the visible one, and it held that wicked men and women could, by forbidden rituals and unholy bargains, draw upon the powers of hell to do their will. To dabble in such arts was not mere sin, but a kind of treason against God himself, a turning away from heaven to traffic with the enemy of mankind. Bound up in the medieval mind with heresy and with the very worship of the devil, one accused of sorcery was therefore charged not with a petty offence, but with a vast spiritual treason, with having sold herself to the fiends of the pit, and the horror that such a thing awakened in every breast is something we, who have ceased to believe in the reality behind it, can only dimly conceive. Whether anyone truly believed the tale is another question, and the answer that the evidence suggests is a revealing one, for the whole conduct of the affair points not to a genuine fear of the Queen's sorcery, but to a cold and a calculated greed. The plain and inconvenient truth behind all the talk of magic was that the Dowager Queen was very rich, and that the monarch who had jailed her was very short of money. Joan held, as her provision for her widowhood, a vast yearly income, one of the largest in the realm, granted to her at her marriage and untouchable, so long as she remained in favour, and the king, draining his treasury dry in the endless and costly wars he waged in France, looked with longing upon that great revenue and wanted it for his own. The cry of witchcraft whatever its origin, served his purpose to perfection, for upon the laying of so grave an accusation, the Queen's goods and her income could be seized into the sovereign's hands, and the war chest replenished from her confiscated wealth. It is the considered judgment of the historians who have studied the affair that the cry of sorcery was, in plain terms, a pretext, a cloak thrown over a simple act of robbery, the means by which a cash-starved king laid his hands upon a wealthy widow's fortune. Joan was not jailed because anyone feared her magic. She was jailed because the king wanted her money. The proof of it lies in the strange and telling manner of her imprisonment, for everything about it shows the hand of policy rather than of justice. Upon the laying of the accusation, her whole fortune was at once confiscated, swept into the royal coffers, and she herself was arrested and carried off to confinement in a series of castles, shut away from the world as a prisoner of the crown. And yet, for all that she was branded a would-be murderess and a dealer in black magic, she was never brought to trial. This is the detail that gives the whole game away, for a queen genuinely believed to have plotted the monarch's death by sorcery would surely have been tried, and, if convicted, punished with the full terrible rigour of the law. Joan was neither tried nor punished. She was simply held, year after year, in a captivity that took her income but left her person in comfort. There was a cold logic to it, as a later scholar would point out, for to try her was to risk an acquittal that would force the return of her wealth, while to convict her was to invite a punishment the king had no real wish to inflict. Far better to keep her quietly imprisoned without any trial at all, enjoying her revenues while holding her in a comfortable confinement that troubled no one's conscience too much. So she was held, uncharged and unjudged, a prisoner of convenience, her wealth feeding the sovereign's wars while her person was kept, as a costly bird is housed, in a gilded cage. And a gilded cage it largely was. For whatever else may be said of Joan's imprisonment, it was not the dark dungeon of romance. She was held first in a great castle by the southern coast, and afterward in another, in the keeping of trusted lords of the king. But she was lodged throughout, in a state befitting her rank, attended by a household of servants, clothed in rich garments, fed upon fine food and wine, and permitted to receive visitors of consequence, even the highest churchmen and nobles of the land. The accounts that survive of her captivity show not a starved and a chained prisoner, but a queen kept in dignified confinement, her comforts maintained, her state preserved, lacking nothing but her liberty and the wealth that had been taken from her. It was imprisonment, but it was the imprisonment of a great lady, and it tells us much about the true purpose of the whole affair. For a king who truly believed his stepmother a murderous witch would hardly have lodged her so softly. And the gentleness of her keeping is one more proof that no one really thought her guilty of anything but the possession of a fortune the crown desired. She was a prisoner of state, not of justice, and her keepers treated her accordingly, with the respect due to a wronged queen whom it was merely convenient, for the present, to hold under lock and key. The castles in which Joan passed her years of captivity have their own histories, and it is worth knowing something of them, for they were not chosen at random, and the chief of them in particular was a place heavy with the past. She was held first in a castle upon the southern coast, an ancient fortress that had begun its life many centuries before as a stronghold of the Romans, guarding the shore against the raiders of the sea. Upon those old Roman walls a mighty castle had risen in the centuries since, and it had played its part in the great turning points of English history. Standing near the very spot where the last conqueror of England had landed with his invading host long ago. By Joan's day the place had seen its best years pass, and parts of it were sliding into decay, but its great walls still stood, formidable and grim, and it was strong and remote enough to serve as a prison for a queen. Set apart upon its lonely shore, far from the centres of power and the eyes of the curious. The man into whose keeping she was given there was a trusted servant of the crown, a knight who had been a faithful supporter of her late husband in the days when he seized his throne, and who had himself defended this very castle in those troubled times. He was a hard and a capable man, a soldier and an administrator, exactly the sort of reliable royal servant to whom the keeping of so delicate a prisoner might safely be confided, and to his charge the fallen queen was committed. To be held securely, but with the respect due to her rank, neither escaping nor suffering open indignity. After a time she was moved from this coastal fortress to another castle further inland, a famous and a beautiful stronghold set upon islands in a lake, one of the loveliest of all the castles of the kingdom. And there, in surroundings of real beauty, she passed the remainder of her captivity, a prisoner still, but a prisoner held in a setting fit for the queen she was. The choice of such places tells us something of the curious character of her imprisonment. For these were not dungeons, but castles of state, strong enough to hold her fast, but grand enough to lodge her with dignity. She was not flung into some dark hole and forgotten, as a common prisoner might be, but lodged in great royal fortresses under the care of trusted lords, kept securely, but kept also in a manner befitting a dowager queen of England. It was confinement, and real confinement, for she was not free to leave, and her wealth had been stripped from her. But it was the confinement of a great personage whom it was thought prudent to keep under lock and key, not the punishment of a convicted criminal. The very grandeur of her prisons is one more proof of the truth that lay beneath the whole affair, that no one really believed her a witch or a murderess, and that the purpose of her keeping was not to punish a crime, but to hold a valuable person quietly out of the way while her wealth was enjoyed by others. We are unusually well informed about the daily texture of Joan's captivity, for the accounts of her household during those years have survived, and they paint a picture very different from the dungeon of romance. A picture of a prisoner kept in something close to royal comfort. Far from being starved or stinted, the captive queen was maintained with a liberal hand, attended by a sizable household of servants and officers who saw to her wants. Clothed in rich and costly garments suited to her station, and fed upon a varied and a plentiful table, with fine meats and good wines, and the delicacies that a person of her rank expected. The records show purchases of expensive cloth and furs, of spices and wine, and all the appurtenances of a great household. Whatever else her captivity took from her, it did not take the material comforts to which she had been bred. And she lived through her imprisonment in a style that many a free person of lesser rank might have envied. Nor was she shut away from all company, for she received visitors during her confinement, and visitors of the highest consequence. The chief churchmen and nobles of the land coming to call upon the imprisoned queen, as though she were holding a sort of court in her captivity. The chief prelates of the kingdom, the highest lords, even members of the royal family itself came to see her in her confinement, a thing that would have been unthinkable had she truly been regarded as a dangerous witch and traitor. One does not pay friendly visits to a convicted plotter against the monarch's life. The freedom with which the great came and went about her prison is one more sign that no one of sense believed the charge against her, that she was understood, by all who mattered, to be not a criminal but a victim, a wronged queen whom it was merely convenient to keep confined, and who might therefore be visited and honoured even in her imprisonment without the least impropriety. All of this comfort, though, should not blind us to the reality of what she suffered, for a gilded cage is a cage still, and the loss that lay at the heart of her captivity was real and grievous. She had lost her liberty, the freedom to go where she would and order her own life. She had lost her great wealth, the dower that was her security and her independence, seized into the king's hands, and she had lost her good name. branded before the whole realm with the foul and the false charge of witchcraft and treason. No quantity of fine food and rich clothing could make good those losses, or sweeten the bitterness of an old woman shut up year after year on a monstrous and a groundless accusation, cut off from her freedom and her fortune and her honour all at once. The comfort of her keeping was real, but so was the wrong of it, and we do her memory no service if we let the one obscure the other. She was used softly, but she was used unjustly, and the softness of the cage did not lessen, to the woman shut inside it, the injustice of being caged at all. Yet comfortable confinement is confinement still, and we should not let the softness of her keeping blind us to the real cruelty of what was done to her. For some 3 years, Joan was held a prisoner. Cut off from the freedom and the standing that were hers by right, branded before the whole realm with the foul charge of witchcraft, stripped of the wealth that was her security and her independence, and left to wonder whether she would ever be free again. She was an aging woman, far from the land of her birth, with one son a prisoner in the same kingdom that now imprisoned her, and the rest of her children scattered across the sea. She had given up everything to come to England, and England had repaid her with a dungeon, however well furnished. The injustice of it was total and naked, the persecution of an innocent and a friendless woman for the sake of her money, dressed up in the language of sorcery to give it a colour of legality. That she bore it, by every sign, with patience and dignity, neither breaking under it nor sinking into despair, is a testament to the same hard strength that had carried her through every trial of her life. But patience does not lessen the wrong, and the wrong done to Joan in those years was as black as any in the annals of her age, the more so for being done, not by an enemy, but by the very king she had loved as a son. Her deliverance, when it came at last, came from the most unexpected quarter of all, from the failing king himself. For after some 3 years of holding his stepmother in her comfortable prison and enjoying the revenues he had stolen from her, the conqueror came to his own end, struck down in the midst of his triumphs by a sickness caught in the field, dying young and at the height of his fame far from home in France. And as he lay at the point of death, with his conscience, perhaps at last awakening to the wrong he had done, the sovereign gave the order that set the old queen free. Only weeks before his death, he commanded that his stepmother be released from her captivity, and that all her confiscated wealth and her dower be restored to her, undoing with his last strength the injustice he had worked upon her. We cannot read the heart of a man 6 centuries dead, and we cannot say with certainty what moved him at the end, whether a true remorse for what he had done, or merely a last wish to clear his account with God and the world before he faced his judgment. But the order was given, and it was obeyed, and Joan walked free at last, restored to her wealth and her honour by the deathbed command of the very king who had taken both from her. It was a strange and a bitter sort of justice, this freedom granted by a perishing conscience, the righting of a wrong only when the wrongdoer stood at the door of death. But it was justice of a kind, and it gave Joan back the long and quiet evening of her life. The years that remained to Joan after her release were quiet ones and merciful, a calm evening after the storms of her middle life. Restored to her wealth and her freedom and her honour, she withdrew from the dangerous heights of affairs into a peaceful and a comfortable retirement, keeping her own court and her own state in the castles granted to her, living out her days as a dowager queen should, honoured and secure and untroubled at last. The warrior king who had wronged her was dead, and the crown had passed to his infant son, a child king who grew up to cherish his step-grandmother. And so the old queen, who had been imprisoned by one king, found herself cherished by the next, treated in her old age with every mark of the respect and kindness that had been denied her in her years of trial. She kept her great houses, chief among them a castle in the Midlands, where she kept her little court, and there she passed the quiet twilight of her life in a tranquility she had seldom known. The trials of her stormy years behind her, the malice of her enemies spent, the wrongs done to her undone at last. It is good to know that her story did not end in the prison, that the woman who had been so cruelly used lived to enjoy years of peace and honour after her deliverance, and was held in her last age in affection by the young king and his court. There survives a record of a costly gift that the boy king gave her near the very end of her life, a fine tablet of gold set with rubies and pearls, and a sapphire, one of the richest presents he gave to anyone that year, a token of the regard in which the old queen stood with the grandson of the husband she had crossed the sea to marry. It is a small thing, but a telling one, for a king who believed his step-grandmother, a witch and a would-be murderess of his own house, would hardly have showered such gifts upon her. And the honour in which she was held at the end is one more quiet proof, if any were needed, that the charge that had ruined her years was always known, in the hearts of those who mattered, to be the empty pretext it was. She had been wronged, and the wrong had been silently acknowledged in the manner of her restoration and the warmth of her last years. And she went down at last to her grave, not as a disgraced and a suspected witch, but as an honoured queen. The England of Joan's last 3 years was a kingdom ruled in the name of a child. For the conqueror who had wronged her did not long survive the deathbed mercy that freed her, dying within weeks and leaving his throne to an infant son not yet a year old. A baby could not govern, and so the realm fell to be ruled by councils of the great lords, the boy's uncles and kinsmen, who held the reins in his name through the long years of his childhood, wrangling among themselves for precedence, even as they carried on the business of the crown. It was an age of regents and protectors, of a sceptre held by a child and wielded by committees, and the strange weakness at the head of the state coloured all the realm beneath it. Into this altered world, the freed Dowager Queen came back, no longer a figure of suspicion to a hard and grasping ruler, but an honoured elder of the royal house, welcomed by a court that had no quarrel with her, and every reason to treat the much-wronged widow of its founder with kindness. The boy king who grew up in those years regarded his step-grandmother with real affection, by every sign, and she in turn seems to have been fond of the gentle, pious child upon whom so heavy a crown had fallen. He honoured her as the elder stateswoman of his house, the last living link to the founder of his line, the widow of his grandfather, and the survivor of an age that was passing. And the marks of his regard were many, culminating in that rich gift of his last new year, the costly tablet of gold and jewels that he bestowed upon her near the very end of her life. It was the gesture of a king who loved and honoured the old queen, who saw in her not the witch of the discredited charge, but the venerable matriarch of his family, and who wished, in the way that kings show such things, to mark his esteem for her with a gift fit for her station. The honour of her last years was the answer of history to the slander of her middle ones, the quiet vindication of a wronged woman by the affection of those who knew her best. So the storms of her life gave way at the last to a calm and an honoured evening, the Dowager Queen living out her days in comfort and respect, the wrongs done to her undone, the wealth restored, the affection of the young king warming her old age. She had been a princess and a duchess and a queen, a regent and a captive and a queen again. She had been loved and distrusted, exalted and cast down, robbed and restored. And now, in the fullness of her years, she came at last to a haven of peace, after all the buffeting, an old woman secure and honoured among a people who had once reviled her. It was not a full reparation, for nothing could give her back the lost years of her captivity, or the children scattered across the sea, or the good name that the slander had stained. But it was a gentle ending, a soft close to a hard life, and we may be glad that the woman who had borne so much was granted, at the end, a measure of the peace that had so long been denied her. Her death, when it came gently, in the fullness of her years, at one of her own houses in the summer of the year, an old woman of nearly 70, who had outlived nearly everyone of her own generation, 3 husbands' worth of history, 2 kings, and the whole world of her youth. She had been a princess of Navarre, a duchess of Brittany, and a queen of England. She had ruled a duchy, shared a throne, and survived a prison. She had given up her children for love, and lost a husband to sickness and a son to captivity, and been branded a witch by the realm she had come to serve. Few lives of her century, and fewer lives of any woman of her age, had run so far or through such strange and varied country, and at the end of it she was gathered, as we all are, into the quiet, an old queen dying peacefully among her people, far from the mountains where she had been born and the Breton shore where she had been happy, in the cold northern kingdom that had used her so hard and honoured her so late. They buried her with all the honour due to a Queen of England, and they laid her where she had surely wished to lie, beside the husband for whose sake she had given up so much. For the young king saw to it that his step-grandmother was carried to the great cathedral at Canterbury, where her husband Henry had been laid to rest a quarter of a century before, and there she was buried at his side. Behind the high altar of that ancient and holy church, the two of them joined in death as they had been joined, against so many obstacles in life. And there, to this day, the traveller may see them still, the king and his foreign queen lying together upon their splendid tomb, their carved images gazing up into the vaulting of the great cathedral. The usurper who took a throne, and the Princess of Navarre who crossed the sea to share it. It is a fitting end to her wanderings, this last rest by the one person for whom she had risked and lost so much. The Duchess and the exile, who had met so many years before in a far country, come home at last to lie together in the heart of the kingdom that had been the making and the breaking of them both. Whatever the world had done to her in life, in death, Joan came to rest in honour, beside her king, in the holiest church of the land. The great minster in which Joan was laid to rest beside her husband was the most renowned and the most holy in all of England, and it makes a fitting last resting place for so much travelled a queen. Canterbury was the mother church of the realm, the seat of its chief archbishop, the spiritual heart of the kingdom, and it was, above all, the home of the most celebrated relic in the land. The tomb of the great martyr saint who had been murdered upon its very stones 2.5 centuries before, struck down by the knights of a king in a quarrel between the crown and the mitre. That murder had made the cathedral the goal of pilgrims beyond counting, who came from every corner of England and from far across the sea to kneel at the martyr's tomb and seek his aid. For generations the road to Canterbury had been thronged with the faithful, and the saint's resting place had become one of the wonders of Christendom, ablaze with the gold and the jewels that the devout had heaped upon it. Within this storied church the king and his queen were laid beneath a monument worthy of their rank, in the chapel at the eastern heart of the cathedral, close to the most sacred ground of all. Upon a great tomb chest their 2 effigies were set side by side, the likenesses of the king and his foreign queen carved in painted alabaster, their hands folded in prayer, their crowned heads at rest upon carved cushions, their stone faces turned forever upward toward the vaulting overhead. It was a fine and a costly tomb, fit for a king of England and the consort who lay by him, and it has weathered the centuries remarkably well, so that the monument may be seen in the cathedral still, the carved king and his carved queen in their painted state as they have lain for close upon 600 years. He remains to this day the one king of England to lie in that great church, and she the one queen. And there is a strange poignancy in the thought that the much-wronged foreign woman, forgotten in so much else, should be remembered here in carved and coloured stone, her likeness kept beside her husband's when so many louder reputations have long since crumbled into dust. There is something deeply fitting in this resting place, for the woman who lies here had known little enough of peace or of permanence in her life above the ground. She had been forever in motion, forever a newcomer, forever shaping herself to some fresh country and some fresh trial. Rest and stillness had been the things most denied her, and a settled home, the luxury she had least often tasted. And here at the last she found them, the peace and the permanence that life had withheld in the quiet of the holy place, beneath the carved stone that would let her be moved no more. The restless pilgrim of a life had come to her final lodging, and a fairer and a quieter one than her stormy years had ever promised. And there she has remained, undisturbed, while the centuries passed over her and the world that had used her so hard forgot, one by one, the very names of those who had tormented her. There is a coda to her story, a final turn of the wheel that she did not live to see, but that she would surely have rejoiced in, and it concerns the son she had lost and found and lost again. The boy taken captive at the great battle and kept so long in English chains. For that son Arthur, freed at last from his captivity after weary years, went on to a career so brilliant that it eclipsed even his mother's strange fame, rising to become one of the foremost soldiers and statesmen of his age. He took service with the crown of France in the very years when that kingdom, beaten almost to its knees by the English, found its champion and its deliverance. He became the great constable of France, the chief commander of its armies, and bore a leading part in the fight that at last drove the English out of France and undid all the conquests that men like Joan's stepson had won. He stood among the captains who fought beside the famous Maid of War, whose name has rung down the centuries, and lived to see the final triumph of the French cause, and, in his own last years, to rule at last the Duchy of Brittany that had been his family's by right. The son whom Henry's England had imprisoned grew up to be one of the chief architects of England's defeat. And there is a kind of justice in it, that the boy whose mother was so cruelly used by the English crown should live to humble that crown upon the field, and to win for France the war that had cost his mother so dear. What then? Are we to make of Joan of Navarre, this much-travelled and much-tried woman who passed through so many countries and conditions and left behind her so strange a fame? She was, above all, a survivor, one of the great survivors of a brutal age, a woman who was tossed by fortune from a mountain kingdom to an Atlantic duchy, to an island throne, and at last into a prison cell, and who came through all of it with her dignity and her spirit unbroken. She endured what would have crushed most people, the loss of her mother in infancy and her freedom in childhood, the marriage to an old stranger, the surrender of her children, the coldness of an unwelcoming land, the slow dying of a husband, the captivity of a son, and at the last the foul slander and the unjust imprisonment that robbed her of her wealth and her good name. And through all of it, she kept her feet, bending before the storms and rising after them, neither broken by cruelty nor soured by injustice. There is a quiet heroism in such endurance, in the steady bearing of blow after blow without collapse or bitterness, and it is the heroism that most truly belongs to her, the unglamorous courage of the woman who simply will not be destroyed. She was, not too, a woman of real ability and real warmth, not merely a passive sufferer of her fate, but a capable ruler and a loving mother and a true wife, who governed a duchy with skill, won the affection of 2 adopted countries, gave up everything she had for love, and bore the loss with grace, and made herself, wherever she went, a figure of substance and regard. The cruelest irony of her story is that this devout and dutiful woman, who never in her life did any deed of darkness, should be remembered above all for a crime she did not commit, branded for all time as the Witch Queen. the only consort of England ever charged with sorcery. The very strangeness of the false accusation has fixed her in the memory of after ages, so that she is known, when she is known at all, for the one thing in her life that was wholly a lie. But we who have followed her story know better. We know her not as a witch, but as a survivor, a princess and a duchess, and a queen who bore more than most could bear, and kept her soul intact through all of it. And who deserves to be remembered, not for the slander that was thrown at her, but for the strength and the grace with which she carried the heavy burden of her remarkable life. There is a way of looking at Joan's life that sees, above all, the story of a woman who belonged to 3 nations and was wholly at ease in none, and it is worth dwelling on, for it catches something essential in her strange destiny. She was born a princess of Navarre, the little mountain realm of her father, and carried its blood and its hard schooling in her all her days. But she departed it while she was still young, and never, so far as we know, returned. So that the land of her birth became a memory and a starting point, rather than a dwelling. She was made a Duchess of Brittany, and lived there the long middle years of her life, and was loved by its people, and bore her children upon its soil. But she was a foreigner there too, a princess of Navarre set over a Breton court, and in the end she quitted Brittany as she had quitted Navarre, sailing away to a third land and a third life. And she became a Queen of England, and lived there longer than anywhere else, and died there and lies there still. But England never accepted her, never ceased to count her a foreigner and an alien, and used her in the end more cruelly than either of the countries she had left. 3 nations claimed her then, and she gave to each of them her service and her loyalty, and yet she was a stranger in all 3, belonging wholly to none. In Navarre she was a daughter of the ruling house, but soon an absent one. In Brittany a beloved duchess, but a foreign-born one. In England a crowned queen, but a distrusted alien. She passed her life crossing borders and learning new tongues and making herself easy among strangers, a perpetual newcomer, a woman forever shaping herself to a country not her own. And there is a kind of rootlessness in her story, a sense of a life lived always among foreigners that lends it a peculiar pathos. She was, in a way that few even of her wandering age could match, a woman without a country, or rather a woman of too many countries, welcome everywhere and nowhere. Carrying her identity with her across the seas, because no single land could fully hold it. And yet there is a strength in that rootlessness, as well as a sorrow. For the woman who belonged to no single nation learned to belong to her own self, to carry her own centre through all her wanderings, to be at rest, in the end, in her own unbreakable spirit, if nowhere else. The borders she crossed and the strangeness she endured taught her the hard self-sufficiency of the perpetual exile, the ability to stand alone, to adapt and survive, and keep her dignity in a world of strangers. And that self-sufficiency was, perhaps, the deepest source of the strength that carried her through her trials. She was a stranger in 3 countries, but she was never a stranger to herself. And when all 3 of her countries had done their worst to her, when Navarre was a distant memory, and Brittany a lost dwelling, and England a prison, she had still her own indomitable self to fall back upon, and it did not fail her. The woman without a country was at the last sufficient to herself, and that sufficiency was her truest dwelling. It is a strange and a melancholy thing that a woman who lived so full and so remarkable a life should be so little remembered. And yet such has been the fate of Joan of Navarre, who has slipped through the centuries almost unnoticed, known to most when she is known at all, for the one thing in her life that was wholly false. The chroniclers of her own age gave her scant attention, as they gave scant attention to most women, and the historians of later times have largely passed her by, so that she has come down to us as a shadowy figure, a name attached to a famous accusation, her real life and her real character lost in the silence that has swallowed so many women of the past. What little has been written of her in her adopted country has tended to dwell upon the sensational episode of the witchcraft charge, fixing her in the memory as the witch queen, the consort accused of sorcery, and passing over the long and various life that lay on either side of that single dark passage. There is a bitter irony in this, that a woman should be remembered above all for a crime she did not commit, that the one episode of her life to catch the attention of after ages should be the false and the slanderous one. The real Joan, the capable duchess and the devoted mother, and the much-tried survivor, has been overshadowed by the phantom of the witch queen, the lurid legend crowding out the truer and the quieter story, and the very strangeness of the false charge, which made it so deadly a weapon in her own day, has made it also the hook on which her whole memory hangs, so that she is known for her slander and forgotten for her life. It is the final injustice of her story, this triumph of the lie, even over her memory. The lie that ruined her years, reaching out across the centuries to distort the way she is remembered, branding her forever with a name she never earned. But the truth survives for those who care to seek it. In the records of her household and the chronicles of her age, and the patient work of the few who have troubled to recover her story, and the truth is worth the seeking, for it gives us, in place of the phantom witch, a real and a remarkable woman, one of the great survivors of a brutal age. To remember Joan rightly is to set aside the falsehood and recover the person, to see past the false charge to the true life, and to give to a much-wronged woman the late justice of being known for what she was, rather than for what her enemies pretended. She was no witch, but a brave and a capable and a sorely tried woman, who bore an extraordinary weight of misfortune with an extraordinary steadiness, and who deserves to be remembered when she is remembered, not with the old calumny, but with the honour that her real life has earned. That is the justice we can still do her across the long centuries, and it is the justice this telling of her story has tried, in its small way, to render. And so we come to the close of her long tale, and it is time to let Joan of Navarre rest. Hers was not a life that the great chronicles dwell upon, not a tale of battles won or kingdoms ruled in her own name. She was a consort and a survivor, a woman to whom history happened, rather than one who shaped it from the throne. But there is a greatness in her that the chronicles miss, the greatness of endurance, of dignity under wrong, of a heart that gave up its children for love and bore the cost without complaint, of a spirit that the malice of kings could imprison but could not break. When the warrior kings who strode across her age are remembered for their conquests, let her be remembered for something quieter and, in its way, more enduring. For the simple, unbreakable strength of a woman who was used hard by the world and was never once unworthy of her own suffering. That is the truest thing we know of her, and it is enough. There are two pictures of Joan of Navarre that we might carry away with us into the quiet of the night. The first is the scene of a parting, the young Duchess standing on the deck of her ship as it draws away from the Breton shore, her eyes upon the receding land where she has left her sons behind, sailing toward a new husband and a new crown across the grey and stormy sea, paying for her second marriage the highest price a mother can pay. Hold that picture a moment, the woman at the rail watching her children's country sink below the horizon, choosing love and a throne over the sons she may never see again, and bearing the unbearable with the quiet courage that was hers. And then, set against it the second, a scene of homecoming, an old queen laid to rest at last in the heart of a great cathedral, by the husband for whose sake she made that parting so long before. The wanderings are over now, the prison is forgotten, the slander is silenced, and the princess of the mountains, who crossed the sea for love and was so ill repaid for it, lies in peace and in honor by her king. The two of them carved in stone, gazing up forever into the high stone vaults. Between those two pictures, the parting and the homecoming, the deck of the ship and the quiet of the tomb, lies the whole arc of her wandering life, and the whole meaning of it too, that love was the thing she chose, and love was the thing that cost her most, and that after all the storms she came home at last to rest by the man she chose. So let her rest now, the Princess of Navarre, the Duchess of Brittany, the Queen they called a witch, in the deep quiet that gathers at the end of every life, however storm-tossed. Let the mountains of her birth and the Atlantic shores of her duchy and the cold castles of her captivity all fall silent together. Let the kings who used her, the children she lost, and the husband she crossed the sea to marry all, lie down with her in the peace that comes to the great and the humble alike. The wanderings are ended now, the wheel has stopped its turning, and the woman who wandered so far and bore so much has come home to the only rest that waits for any of us. There is nothing left to fear now. No more seas to cross, no more storms to weather, no more wrongs to bear. Only the quiet and the dark and the long ease of sleep. And as her world grows dim and still around us, let yours grow dim and still as well. The night is far on now, and you have travelled far back into it, and there is nothing left for you to hold on to. Let the candles of those vanished courts gutter out one by one. Let the old voices fade. Let the warmth of your own bed gather you in, and your breath grow slow and even, and your thoughts loosen their hold and begin to drift away into the dark, down toward the place where the story and the sleeper become one. And the long night closes gently over all. Before you slip away entirely, let me thank you, quietly, for spending these few hours of the night in such old and faraway company. If the evening we have passed together is the kind of journey you would care to take again, you are always welcome to subscribe whenever the wish should come to you, and another of these quiet nights will find its way to you in time. There is no hurry about any of it, it is simply here, waiting whenever you should want to come back. But that is a matter for the daylight, and the daylight is far off. For now there is only the night, and the rest you have earned, and the last few words I leave with you as you go: sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.